Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. There are some nights you never forget, nights when the cold doesn't just seep into your bones, but into your mind, your very soul. For me, that night came while I was on patrol in the remote stretches of the Appalachian wilderness, a place where the trees stand tall like ancient sentinels, where shadows seem thicker and silence is heavy. I've been a park ranger for over 15 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things. But nothing prepared me for what happened that night. I remember standing there, the moon casting pale light over the treetops, the wind biting at my cheeks. It was just after 2 a.m., the dead of night, when the world feels different, more raw, more exposed. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I made my way down the narrow trail, a route I'd walked hundreds of times before. But this time, it felt off. Something wasn't right. Then I heard it, a scream, but not like anything I'd ever heard before. It echoed off the mountainside, sharp and agonizing, like something or someone was in unimaginable pain. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest, the sound lingering in the air long after it had faded. It was so unnatural, so gut-wrenching, that my instincts screamed at me to turn back, to get the hell out of there. But I'm a ranger, and my job is to help. If there was someone out there, hurt or in danger, I had to find them. So I swallowed my fear, tightened my grip on my flashlight, and started toward the source of the scream. The trail took me deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around me like walls. The wind had picked up, sending leaves and debris swirling in the air, and with every gust, the shadows seemed to shift, like the woods were alive and watching. My breath was visible in the cold night air, coming in quick, shallow bursts as my nerves got the better of me. I radioed in, "Base, this is David. I just heard a scream. I'm on the East Ridge Trail, moving to investigate. Over." Static crackled in my ear for a moment before the response came. "Copy that, David. Proceed with caution. Over." "Roger that," I muttered, though my words felt weak against the rising tension in my chest. My feet crunched softly on the dirt path, but the world around me was eerily silent now, like even the wind had decided to hold its breath. Then I saw the clearing up ahead, bathed in moonlight. At the far edge, the trees seemed to part, revealing a wide open space surrounded by thick underbrush, and that's when I saw them, footprints, huge, heavy, and deep, stamped into the soft earth. They were unlike anything I'd seen before. Too large to be human, but too defined to belong to any animal I knew of in the region. I knelt down, shining my flashlight over them. Each print was about twice the size of my boot, with a long, claw-like indentation at the tips of what I assumed were toes. My stomach churned as I tried to make sense of it. Bear tracks? Maybe, but something wasn't adding up. Before I could dwell on it further, there was another sound. This one wasn't a scream. It was more of a low, guttural growl, rumbling from somewhere deep within the trees ahead of me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I rose to my feet, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Nothing. The beam of light revealed only trees, branches swaying in the wind, and the ever-looming darkness beyond. But I could feel it. Something was out there, watching me. I'm not a guy who scares easily, but every fiber of my being was telling me to leave, to run. But again, that damn ranger instinct kicked in. Maybe it was just a bear after all, and I was jumping to conclusions. Still, I had to be sure. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves, and stepped forward into the clearing, following the trail of prints that led toward the far side of the tree line. As I moved closer, the growl came again, louder this time, reverberating through the trees. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the woods. I tapped it hard, muttering a curse under my breath. I had to get this under control. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow darting between the trees, moving fast, too fast for me to track. I whipped my flashlight in its direction, but whatever it was had disappeared. My heart was pounding now, my hands sweating despite the cold. Something was out here, something big. The scream came again, splitting the night like a knife. It was closer this time, much closer. My legs felt rooted to the spot, fear gripping me like a vice. I was alone out here, in the middle of nowhere, and whatever this thing was, it wasn't friendly. I fumbled for the radio at my belt, trying to keep my voice steady. "Base, this is David. I've got something out here with me. Can't confirm what it is, but it's big, real big. Over." There was no response, just static. I cursed again, slamming the radio back into place. The fear was turning into adrenaline now, my fight-or-flight instinct kicking in. But I wasn't about to run. Not yet. I had to know what I was dealing with. Suddenly, the trees in front of me parted with a violent crash. I spun around, flashlight in hand, heart racing as I pointed it toward the source of the noise, and that's when I saw it. Standing there, half hidden in the shadows, was a massive figure. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, its hulking frame covered in thick, matted hair. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the beam of my flashlight, stared back at me with a predatory intensity. And those eyes, they weren't like an animal's. They had a cold, calculating intelligence, like something that knew exactly what it was doing. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my mind was struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't a bear. Hell, it wasn't anything I'd ever seen in my life. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, its breath visible in the cold air as it took a slow, deliberate step toward me. I could see the muscles rippling beneath its fur, the power in every movement. It was toying with me, sizing me up. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at it. Time seemed to stretch and warp around me, my senses dulled by the sheer terror that had taken hold of me. Then, without warning, the creature lunged forward, closing the distance between us in an instant. I stumbled back, my flashlight clattering to the ground as I reached for the sidearm at my hip. My fingers fumbled with the holster, my movements frantic as the creature bore down on me. I barely managed to draw my weapon before it was on top of me, its massive hand, paw, claw, whatever it was, swiping toward me with terrifying speed. I fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the trees, loud and sharp, cutting through the stillness of the night. The creature recoiled, a pained snarl ripping from its throat as it stumbled back. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the forest floor as I sprinted back toward the trail. Branches whipped at my face, the cold air burning in my lungs as I ran faster than I ever had before. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the trees, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground as it gave chase. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept running, my mind racing, heart pounding, as I tried to remember the way back to the ranger station. It was a blur, my legs burning, muscles screaming in protest. But I didn't stop. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I burst through the tree line and into the clearing where the station stood. I slammed the door shut behind me, collapsing against it, gasping for breath. My hands were shaking, my heart still racing, but I was alive, barely. The next morning, I went back to that spot with backup, but the footprints were gone. There was no sign of the creature, no evidence of the struggle. Nothing, just the cold wind and the trees, standing tall and silent, like sentinels guarding their secrets. Story 2. I never believed in monsters until that night in Blackwood Forest. As a park ranger, I'd seen my fair share of wildlife, but nothing could have prepared me for what lurked in those shadows. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. It was late September, and the air had that crisp bite that signals the arrival of fall. The leaves were just starting to turn, splashing the forest with hints of gold and red. I'd been a ranger at Blackwood National Park for 5 years, and I loved every minute of it. The solitude, the connection with nature, the satisfaction of protecting this slice of wilderness. It was my dream job. That evening, I was making my usual rounds, checking on the campsites and making sure everyone was following park regulations. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. As I drove my patrol vehicle along the winding forest road, my radio crackled to life. "Sarah, you copy." It was Mike, my supervisor, back at headquarters. I grabbed the radio. "Go ahead, Mike. We've got some campers at Site 14 reporting strange noises and something big moving around their site last night. Can you swing by and check it out?" 10-4, I'm on my way, I responded, already turning onto the dirt road that led to the more remote campsites. As I drove, I ran through the possibilities in my mind. Bear, certainly possible, though we hadn't had many problems with them this season. Elk, also likely, as they were in the middle of their rut. Whatever it was, I was confident I could handle it. I'd dealt with plenty of wildlife encounters before. I pulled up to campsite 14 just as the last rays of sunlight were fading. A middle-aged couple was sitting by their fire, looking nervous. I stepped out of my vehicle and approached them with a friendly smile. "Evening, folks. I'm Ranger Sarah. I heard you had some trouble last night." The woman, introduced as Linda, spoke up first. "Oh, thank goodness you're here. It was terrifying." Something huge was moving around our campsite. We could hear it breathing. Her husband, Tom, nodded in agreement. "I've been camping my whole life, and I've never heard anything like it. It wasn't a bear, I'm sure of that. The sounds it made, they were almost human, but not quite." I listened carefully, taking notes. "Did you see anything?" Linda shook her head. "It was too dark, but we saw the shadows moving. And in the morning, we found some of our food supplies torn up." I spent the next half hour examining the campsite. There were some large tracks in the soft earth near their tent, but they were smudged and unclear. Whatever had been here was big, that much was certain. I advised the couple on proper food storage and promised to keep an eye on the area. As I was about to leave, Tom grabbed my arm. "Ranger, there's one more thing. When it was out there, in the dark, we heard it. Well, it sounded like it was trying to talk." A chill ran down my spine, but I kept my face neutral. "I'm sure it was just the wind playing tricks. You two try to get some rest, and don't hesitate to call if you need anything." I got back in my vehicle, but I didn't leave right away. The sun had fully set now, and the forest was plunged into darkness. I sat there, listening to the night sounds of the woods. Crickets chirped, an owl hooted in the distance. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Making a decision, I radioed back to headquarters. "Mike, I'm going to stick around Site 14 for a while. Keep an eye on things." "Copy that, Sarah. Be careful out there." I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and decided to do a sweep of the area surrounding the campsite. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and underbrush. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. I'd never felt so on edge in these woods before. After about 20 minutes of patrol, I was starting to feel foolish. It was probably just a bear or elk after all. And here I was, jumping at shadows like a rookie. I was about to head back to my vehicle when I heard it, a branch snapping, much too loud to be caused by any small animal. I swung my flashlight in the direction of the sound. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a dark shape, much taller than a man, moving between the trees. But when I focused the beam, there was nothing there. My heart was pounding now. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Park Ranger Sarah. If there's someone out there, please identify yourself." Silence. Not just quiet, but an absolute absence of sound. The crickets had stopped chirping. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath, and then I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd experienced before. I began to back away slowly, my flashlight beam darting from tree to tree. That's when I saw the eyes, two glowing orbs reflecting the light, set much higher than any normal animal's would be. They blinked once, and I realized whatever I was looking at was massive. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Running would only trigger a predator's chase response. So I continued to back away slowly, my hand inching towards the bear spray on my belt. A low, guttural sound came from the direction of those eyes. It was almost like speech, but distorted and inhuman. The shape moved, and I caught a glimpse of dark fur and a massive, hunched silhouette. My back hit something solid, a tree. I had nowhere left to go. The creature took a step forward, and I raised my flashlight, finally getting a clear view of what was in front of me. It was tall, at least 8 feet, covered in dark, matted fur. Its body was powerfully built, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was a twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, a protruding snout, sharp teeth visible in a partially open mouth, but with eyes that held an unsettling intelligence. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, the creature tilted its head, almost as if it were studying me. It made that guttural, speech-like sound again. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I spoke, "I don't want any trouble. This is your home. I'm just here to protect it." To my utter astonishment, the creature's posture seemed to relax slightly. It blinked those glowing eyes and took a small step back. Then, with a speed and grace that should have been impossible for something so large, it turned and vanished into the darkness of the forest. I stood there, my back against the tree, for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. It defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. When I finally found the strength to move, I hurried back to my vehicle on shaky legs. I sat behind the wheel, my hands trembling as I picked up the radio. "Mike," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "you're not going to believe what just happened." In the days and weeks that followed, I questioned everything. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Was there a rational explanation? But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something out there in Blackwood Forest, something that didn't fit neatly into our understanding of the world. I never reported the full extent of what I saw that night. Who would believe me? But I still patrol those woods. And sometimes, when the sun is setting and the shadows grow long, I feel those eyes watching me. And I wonder, am I protecting the park from it, or is it protecting the park from us? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at those woods the same way again, because now I know that sometimes the monsters from our campfire stories are real, and they're watching, waiting, in the darkness between the trees. Story 3. There are moments in the woods when everything goes quiet. No birds, no rustling of leaves, no sound of running water. Just an overwhelming silence that presses in on you, wrapping around your thoughts and tightening like a noose. I'd spent my life hunting, tracking animals across the dense forests of Michigan, and I knew the sounds of the wild like the back of my hand. But that silence, when it comes, you know something is wrong. That day, I felt it deep in my bones. I'd been out since dawn, following a deer trail up through a thick stretch of forest on the northern side of the ridge. The morning was crisp, the air sharp with the scent of pine and earth. My rifle rested comfortably over my shoulder, and I moved quietly, as I always did, keeping low to the ground and careful not to disturb the underbrush. The tracks I'd been following were fresh, too fresh to ignore. I knew that deer was close, probably within a few hundred yards, but by midday something shifted. I hadn't heard a single bird call for over an hour, and the breeze that had been gently rustling the trees seemed to vanish. It was as if the whole forest had gone still, watching, waiting. I crouched down to inspect the trail, and that's when I saw it. The tracks I'd been following suddenly ended, like the deer had simply vanished into thin air. No blood, no sign of struggle, nothing. I frowned, running a hand over the ground, trying to make sense of it. I'd seen deer trails end before. Sometimes they veer off suddenly, or the ground gets too rocky to leave a clear impression. But this was different. The tracks just stopped. I stood up, scanning the trees around me, the hairs on the back of my neck starting to prickle. That's when I heard the first snap. A branch breaking in the distance, followed by the sound of something moving through the brush. Not fast, not aggressive, but deliberate, like it was circling. My grip tightened on my rifle, the weight of it suddenly more comforting in my hands. I turned slowly, trying to pinpoint the direction of the noise. It came again, a crunch, this time closer. I strained my eyes, peering through the thick trees, but I couldn't see anything. "Bear," I muttered under my breath, though I wasn't convinced. I'd come across bears before, even had a few close encounters. But they didn't move like this. Bears are loud, clumsy in the way they barrel through the woods, not subtle like this thing. I took a slow step back, my boots pressing into the soft earth, and the silence returned. The woods felt like they were closing in around me, the air growing thicker with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel a cold sweat starting to form at the back of my neck. Something was out there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Watching, waiting. Instinct took over. I raised my rifle, scanning the tree line, my finger hovering over the trigger. I didn't know what I was looking for, just a shadow, a flash of movement, anything to tell me where it was. But the forest around me was still, the trees standing tall and silent, their branches swaying ever so slightly in the breeze that had returned. Another snap, closer this time, directly to my right. I whipped around, rifle aimed, my pulse quickening. There, just beyond a cluster of pines, something moved, a shadow, massive and quick, disappearing behind the trees before I could fully register it. My breath caught in my throat. That wasn't a bear. I held my ground, not daring to move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. It had been tall, far taller than any bear, moving on two legs, fast, deliberate. I blinked, shaking my head. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe the shadows were messing with my head, but I knew better. The woods were still again, the silence thicker than before. My hands were shaking now, my rifle steady but my body tense, every nerve on high alert. I didn't know what to do. I'd never been in a situation like this before. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal I'd ever encountered. It was something different, something smarter. The silence stretched on, and for a brief moment I considered turning back, heading down the trail and out of the woods altogether. But I was a hunter. I didn't run from the woods. The woods were my territory, my home. Whatever was out here with me, I needed to understand it, to face it. I took a slow step forward, my boots sinking into the damp earth, every muscle in my body tensed. Another step and another. My eyes scanned the trees, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of what had been following me. Then I saw it, between the trees, maybe 50 yards ahead. It stood. Tall, impossibly tall, its body covered in thick matted hair. Its shoulders were broad, its arms hanging low, almost brushing the ground. But what struck me the most, what sent a jolt of fear straight through my chest, were its eyes. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were intelligent, calculating. It was watching me. For a moment, we stood there, locked in some silent standoff. I didn't move. Neither did it. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The rifle felt useless in my hands. I knew, somehow, that if I fired, it wouldn't do a damn thing. The creature, Whatever it was, tilted its head as if studying me, considering its next move. Then slowly, it took a step forward. My body reacted before my mind did. I stumbled back, almost tripping over a root, my eyes wide with fear. The thing took another step, its massive feet sinking into the earth, barely making a sound. Its presence was overwhelming, its size terrifying, and yet it wasn't attacking. It was closing the distance, slowly, methodically, as if it had all the time in the world. I needed to move. Now, without thinking, I turned and ran. I'd never run like that before in my life. My boots pounded against the earth, branches slashing at my arms and face as I tore through the underbrush, not caring where I was going, only that I was getting the hell away from that thing. Behind me, I could hear it moving, crashing through the trees, but it wasn't rushing. It wasn't chasing me like a predator after prey. It was stalking me, following me at its own pace, like it knew I couldn't escape. I didn't dare look back. The trail ahead was a blur, my vision narrowing as adrenaline surged through my veins. My lungs burned, my legs aching with every stride, but I couldn't stop. Not until I was out of the woods, not until I was safe. I broke through the trees and into a small clearing. My truck was parked just beyond, the sight of it like a beacon of hope in the chaos of my panicked mind. I sprinted toward it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my fingers already fumbling for the keys in my pocket. Behind me, the crashing in the woods grew louder, closer. I reached the truck, practically throwing myself against the door as I yanked it open and dove inside. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires kicked up dirt as I sped down the gravel road, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I saw it, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. Its massive form was still, its eyes locked onto mine through the mirror. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the forest. I didn't stop driving until I reached town. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Those eyes, burning into my mind. I'd hunted in those woods for years, spent my life among the trees, tracking animals, learning their ways. But whatever I had encountered out there that day wasn't something I could explain. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. The silence of the woods had changed for me. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was a warning. And I knew deep down that I'd never set foot in those woods again. Story 4. I used to think camping was all about peaceful nights under the stars and tranquil mornings with birdsong. That was before the night something straight out of a nightmare visited our campsite in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. My name is Mike, and this is the story of how a romantic getaway with my girlfriend Jenny turned into the most terrifying experience of our lives. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend. Jenny and I had been dating for a year, and we both loved the outdoors. When I suggested a camping trip to celebrate our anniversary, she jumped at the idea. We chose a spot deep in the Cascade Mountains, an area known for its breathtaking beauty and, as we'd soon discover, its connection to local Sasquatch legends. The drive up was gorgeous, winding roads taking us through dense forests and past crystal-clear streams. As we set up our tent in a small clearing, I couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation. The nearest town was over 50 miles away, and we hadn't seen another soul for hours. "This is perfect," Jenny said, stretching her arms wide and taking a deep breath of the pine-scented air. "I can't believe we have this all to ourselves," I smiled, pulling her close for a kiss. "Just you, me, and whatever critters are hiding in these woods." We spent the afternoon hiking, marveling at the towering trees and the occasional glimpse of snow-capped peaks in the distance. As the sun began to set, we returned to our campsite to build a fire and cook dinner, sitting by the crackling flames, roasting marshmallows and sipping wine from plastic cups. Everything felt idyllic. Jenny leaned against me, her head on my shoulder. "You know," she said, her voice playful, "they say this area is a hot spot for Bigfoot sightings." I chuckled. "Don't tell me you believe in that stuff." She shrugged. "I'm just saying, a lot of people have reported seeing something up here. Maybe we'll get lucky and spot the elusive beast ourselves." "I think I'd prefer if Bigfoot kept his distance," I replied, only half joking. The idea of something large and unknown lurking in the darkness around us sent a shiver down my spine. As the fire died down to embers, we retired to our tent. The sounds of the forest at night were both soothing and slightly unnerving, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But eventually, wrapped in our sleeping bags and each other's arms, we drifted off to sleep. I'm not sure what time it was when I first woke up. The inside of the tent was pitch black, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then I heard it, heavy footsteps, slowly circling our campsite. My first thought was bear. We'd been careful with our food, storing it properly, but bears were always a concern in this area. I lay perfectly still, listening intently. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They didn't sound like a bear lumbering around. Whatever this was, it was walking on two legs. I felt Jenny stir beside me. "Mike," she whispered, fear evident in her voice. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, then realized she couldn't see me in the darkness. "Yeah," I whispered back. "Just stay still. It's probably just a deer or something." But I knew it wasn't a deer. The footsteps were too heavy, the gait too long. My mind raced through possibilities, another camper, a park ranger, but deep down, I knew it was neither of those things. The footsteps stopped near the entrance of our tent. I could hear deep, heavy breathing. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure whatever was out there must be able to hear it. Jenny's hand found mine in the darkness, squeezing tight. Then, without warning, something large bumped against the side of the tent. Jenny let out a small gasp, quickly muffled by her other hand. I held my breath, straining my ears. The breathing outside grew louder, more deliberate. It sounded like it was sniffing the air. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the direction of our campfire. It sounded like our cooler being knocked over. The heavy footsteps moved away from our tent, towards the sound. "What's happening?" Jenny whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my own fear in check. "I think it's going through our supplies." We lay there in terrified silence, listening to the sounds of something large rummaging through our campsite. Occasionally, we'd hear a low grunt or a sound almost like speech, but distorted and inhuman. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the noises stopped. The forest fell into an eerie silence. No owls, no rustling in the underbrush. It was as if every living thing was holding its breath. "I think it's gone," I whispered after several minutes of silence. Jenny's grip on my hand tightened. "Are you sure? Maybe we should call for help." I shook my head, forgetting again that she couldn't see me. No cell service out here, remember? And I'm not sure we should draw attention to ourselves. I knew I had to do something. Whatever had visited our camp might come back, and I couldn't stand the thought of being trapped in this flimsy tent if it did. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped my sleeping bag. "What are you doing?" Jenny hissed. "I'm going to take a look," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Just stay here, okay? I'll be right back." Before she could protest, I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight. Our campfire had long since died out, leaving only a faint glow from the embers. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Then I saw the destruction. Our cooler was overturned, its contents strewn across the ground. Our backpacks had been pulled from the tree where we'd hung them, their contents similarly scattered, but what made my blood run cold were the footprints. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own feet, and deeply pressed into the soft earth. They were roughly human in shape, but the toes were too long, the arch too pronounced. Whatever had made these prints was no human, and no bear either. I was about to duck back into the tent when I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A massive, dark shape was moving between the trees. It was hard to make out details in the dim light, but I could see that it walked upright, its head easily 8 or 9 feet off the ground. As it moved, I caught a glimpse of matted fur and long, powerful arms. My heart nearly stopped when it paused, turning its head in my direction. For a brief moment, I saw eyes reflecting the moonlight, and I knew it was looking right at me. A low, rumbling sound came from its direction. Not quite a growl, not quite speech. I don't remember closing the tent flap or zipping it shut. The next thing I knew, I was back in my sleeping bag, holding Jenny close as we both trembled in fear. "What did you see?" she whispered. I couldn't find the words to describe it. "We need to leave," was all I managed to say. "And as soon as it's light, we pack up and go." The rest of the night was the longest of my life. Every sound, every rustle of leaves had us on edge. We didn't sleep, didn't even speak. We just held each other, waiting for dawn. As the first light of day filtered through the tent fabric, we cautiously emerged. The destruction looked even worse in the daylight. Deep scratches marked the trees around our campsite. Our food was gone, wrappers and containers torn to shreds. We packed up in record time, not even bothering to clean up the mess. As I was loading the last bag into the car, I saw it, a clump of coarse, dark hair caught on a low-hanging branch. Without thinking, I grabbed it, stuffing it into my pocket. The drive back to civilization was tense and quiet. We were both trying to process what had happened, what we had experienced. It wasn't until we were back in cell phone range that Jenny finally broke the silence. "Mike," she said, her voice steady despite everything, "what do you think that was last night?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter, thinking of the hair in my pocket, the footprints, the massive shape I'd seen in the moonlight. "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but I don't think we were supposed to see it. We never went camping in that area again. In fact, it was a long time before either of us felt comfortable in the woods at all. The hair I collected sits in a small box in my desk drawer. I've thought about having it analyzed, but part of me is afraid of what I might learn. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those heavy footsteps in my dreams, and I wonder if we go back to those woods, would it be waiting for us? Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved. Because once you've glimpsed something that shouldn't exist, you can never unsee it, and you never know when it might decide to pay you another visit. Story 5. There are things you don't notice at first, small signs that something's off, but you brush them aside, you rationalize them, make excuses, you tell yourself it's just the wind or an animal, and that you've been out here long enough to know better. But then there's that moment, the one when it all clicks, when every hair on the back of your neck stands up and you know you've been wrong. That's what happened to me the day I found those trees. I'm Megan, a wildlife biologist who has spent years studying animal behavior in remote forests. It's a career I love, one that's taken me to some of the most beautiful, untouched places in the country. The woods were my home, my sanctuary. I was used to the rhythms of nature, the ways animals moved, hunted, and survived. But what I found that day in the Appalachian wilderness wasn't in any field guide I'd ever studied. I was out on one of my routine hikes, tracking deer migration patterns deep in the forest. It was late afternoon, and I had ventured further than usual, the familiar trail slowly fading into more rugged terrain. My GPS told me I was still on course, but there was no official path here. Just me, the trees, and the endless stretch of wild that surrounded me. That's when I first saw them. The trees. At first glance, they looked normal enough. Towering pines and oaks, their thick trunks scarred by the natural wear of time. But as I walked closer, I noticed something strange. Deep gouges, long and deliberate, running from the base of the trees all the way up to the highest branches. These weren't the random scratches of a bear or some other animal. These were precise, methodical, like something had clawed at the bark with intent. I crouched down, running my fingers over the grooves. They were deep, far deeper than anything I'd ever seen from an animal. Bears will sometimes scratch trees to mark their territory, but this was different. The marks were spaced too evenly, too far apart. Whatever had made them had claws longer than any animal I knew of in this region. I straightened up, glancing around the clearing. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I'd been hiking for hours, but now the usual sounds of the woods, the birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, had all but disappeared. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I shook off the unease that was creeping up my spine. I was a scientist. There had to be a logical explanation for this. Maybe it was a bear, an unusually large one. Or maybe some other animal had passed through, one I wasn't familiar with. I was here to study wildlife, not jump at shadows. Still, I made a note of the location on my GPS and took a few photos of the trees, documenting the strange marks. I figured I'd show them to one of my colleagues when I got back. Maybe they'd seen something like this before. I turned to leave, but as I did, something caught my eye. Movement, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I froze, squinting into the shadows between the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a large shape, tall and broad, slipping silently through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat. A bear, I told myself. It's just a bear. But something about the way it moved, too fast, too fluid, didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every instinct in my body was telling me to leave, to get the hell out of there. But curiosity won out. I took a few tentative steps forward, peering into the forest where the shape had disappeared. Nothing. The underbrush was thick, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I must have imagined it. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm my racing heart. I was out here alone, no backup. No one knew exactly where I was. If it really was a bear, I couldn't afford to take any risks. I turned back toward the trail, deciding it was time to head back to camp. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like there were eyes following my every move. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching against the fallen leaves, the air growing colder as dusk settled in. About a mile later, I stopped for a drink, leaning against a tree and trying to shake the unease that had followed me since the clearing. I took a long gulp from my water bottle, the cool liquid doing little to calm my nerves. I was being paranoid, I told myself. I'd been in these woods 100 times before without any issue. This was no different. Then I heard it, a branch snapping behind me. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there, just the dense forest, the fading light casting strange shadows on the trees. I strained my ears, listening for any sound of movement, but all I heard was the wind in the trees, whispering like it always did. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I shoved my water bottle back into my pack and started walking again, this time faster, my footsteps quick and purposeful. The trees seemed to close in around me, the trail narrowing as I moved deeper into the woods. Another snap, closer this time. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced over my shoulder, my breath catching in my throat. That's when I saw it, just for a split second, barely visible through the trees, a shadow, tall and impossibly wide, moving silently through the underbrush, keeping pace with me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse racing. The thing, whatever it was, stopped too, hidden just out of sight. I was a scientist, a rational person. But all the rational explanations in the world couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. I wasn't dealing with an animal, not one I'd ever seen before, anyway. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I was miles from the nearest road, and there was no way I could outrun whatever was out there. My only option was to keep moving, stay calm, and hope that whatever was stalking me would lose interest. I started walking again, my movements slow and deliberate, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of the creature. I could feel it now, its presence, heavy and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. It wasn't just following me, it was hunting me. I don't know how long I walked like that, my mind a blur of fear and adrenaline. The light was fading fast, and the shadows were growing longer, darker. Every step felt like a struggle, my legs heavy with exhaustion, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. And then, without warning, the silence broke. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees, so close that I could feel the vibrations in my bones. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep and primal, filled with an intelligence that sent a chill down my spine. Slowly, I turned to face the direction of the growl, my hands trembling. My eyes searched the darkened forest, but I couldn't see it. I could only feel it, its eyes on me, its breath heavy in the air. For a moment, I stood there, paralyzed by fear. Then, without thinking, I ran. I sprinted through the trees, my feet pounding against the forest floor, my breath ragged in my throat. Branches whipped at my face, the cold air stinging my lungs, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there, to put as much distance between me and whatever was hunting me as possible. Behind me, I heard it moving. Fast, silent, always just out of sight. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake it. It was like it was playing with me, letting me think I could escape before closing in again. I don't know how I made it back to the trailhead. By the time I burst out of the trees and into the small parking area where my truck was parked, my legs were shaking, my lungs burning. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat, and finally managed to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me. For a long moment I sat there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I half expected the creature to come crashing out of the trees after me, but the forest remained still, silent. I didn't stick around to find out if it was still there. I drove out of those woods like the devil himself was on my tail, my mind racing, my heart pounding. Whatever I'd encountered out there wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that didn't belong in the natural order of things. I never went back to that part of the forest again. Story 6. I've led hundreds of hiking groups through the Rockies, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in Thunder Basin. What started as a routine trek turned into a nightmare that still haunts me. My name is Tom, and this is the story of how a freak storm and an ancient cave changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. It was supposed to be a 3-day hike through some of the most beautiful terrain in Colorado. Our group was small, just 5 of us, including myself. There was Sarah, a college student on her first real mountain trek, Mike and Lisa, a middle-aged couple celebrating their anniversary, and Dave, a grizzled outdoorsman who'd seen it all. Or so we thought. The first day went smoothly. We made good time. The weather was perfect and spirits were high. As we set up camp that evening, I noticed some dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Nothing too concerning, I thought. Mountain weather can be unpredictable, but we were prepared for a little rain. How wrong I was. The storm hit us in the middle of the night with a fury I'd never experienced before. The wind howled like a banshee, ripping at our tents. Rain lashed down in sheets so thick it was hard to breathe. Lightning lit up the sky in continuous flashes, followed by thunder that shook the ground beneath us. "We need to move," I shouted over the cacophony, struggling to make myself heard. "This valley isn't safe." Grabbing what we could, we abandoned our camp and started moving uphill. The trail had turned into a muddy torrent, making every step treacherous. Sarah slipped and would have been swept away if Dave hadn't caught her arm. "There!" Mike yelled, pointing. Through the curtain of rain, I could just make out the dark mouth of a cave, set into the mountainside. It wasn't ideal, but it was our best option for shelter. We stumbled into the cave, soaked to the bone and shivering. The sound of the storm was muffled, but still intense. As we caught our breath, I did a head count, 5. We'd all made it. "Is everyone okay?" I asked, shining my flashlight around our group. They nodded, too exhausted to speak. As the adrenaline wore off, I began to take stock of our situation. We'd lost most of our gear in the mad dash from the campsite. We had some water, a few energy bars, and thankfully, our flashlights. But we were in trouble if the storm didn't let up soon. "Let's see how deep this cave goes," I suggested. "We might find a drier spot to rest." We moved deeper into the cave, our flashlights casting long shadows on the rocky walls. That's when I noticed something odd. The walls weren't smooth like most caves I'd seen. They were marked with long, deep scratches. "Hey, Tom," Dave called out, his voice echoing slightly. "You ever seen anything like this?" I moved my light to where he was pointing. My breath caught in my throat. There, on the cave wall, were paintings, but not the kind of native art I'd seen before. These were crude, almost childlike, depicting tall, misshapen figures with elongated limbs and sharp claws. "What is that supposed to be?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Probably just some kids messing around," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But deep down, I knew these paintings were old, very old. We pressed on, the cave seeming to go deeper and deeper into the mountain. The scratches on the walls became more frequent, deeper. A musty animal smell began to permeate the air. "Maybe we should head back towards the entrance," Lisa suggested, voicing what we were all thinking. I was about to agree when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very walls of the cave. We all froze. "What was that?" Mike whispered, his flashlight beam darting nervously around the cave. Probably just the wind," I said, but I didn't believe it. The sound had been too deep, too alive. We stood in silence, straining our ears. For a moment, all we could hear was the muffled storm and our own heavy breathing. Then, unmistakably, the sound of something large moving in the darkness ahead of us. "Back!" I hissed. "Move back slowly!" We began to retreat, our eyes fixed on the impenetrable darkness beyond our flashlight beams. That's when Sarah's light caught something that made my heart stop. A pair of eyes, reflecting the light, set far higher than any normal animal's should be. "Run!" I yelled, all pretense of calm abandoned. We turned and ran, our lights bouncing wildly off the cave walls. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind us, accompanied by a guttural roar that shook loose rocks from the ceiling. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to stretch and distort in the darkness. All I knew was that we had to get out, had to reach the cave entrance before whatever was chasing us caught up. Finally, mercifully, I saw a glimmer of natural light ahead. The cave mouth. We burst out into the open air, the storm still raging but seeming tame compared to the terror we'd just fled. "Keep going!" I shouted, urging the group down the mountainside. We didn't stop until we'd put a good distance between us and the cave. Finally, gasping for breath, we paused in a small copse of trees. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle. What was that thing?" Sarah panted, her eyes wide with fear. I shook my head, unable to find words. How could I explain something I couldn't understand myself? Dave was the first to speak. "I've been in these mountains for 30 years, he said, his usual bravado gone. "Never seen or heard anything like that." We huddled together as the storm gradually subsided, each lost in our own thoughts. As the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds, we started making our way down the mountain. We were cold, wet, and terrified, but alive. It took us most of the day to reach the ranger station. We reported the incident, but I could see the skepticism in the ranger's eyes as we told our story. Without proof, it sounded like nothing more than a ghost story, born from the terror of the storm. In the years since that night, I've led many more hikes through the Rockies, but I've never gone back to Thunder Basin. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I'm transported back to that cave. I see those ancient paintings, smell that musky odor, and hear that bone-chilling roar. I've researched local legends, trying to make sense of what we encountered. There are stories, passed down through generations, of something lurking in those mountains. Something ancient and terrifying. The natives called it the Wendigo, a creature of insatiable hunger and unimaginable strength. Do I believe in monsters now? I'm not sure. But I do know this. There are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that lurk in the dark places, in the depths of caves and the hearts of storms. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just stumble upon them. So if you're ever hiking in the Rockies and come across a cave in Thunder Basin, take my advice. Keep walking. Some shelters are more dangerous than the storms they protect you from. And some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 7. There's an eerie kind of silence that only the wilderness can produce, where the stillness becomes so heavy, it feels like it's pressing down on your chest. It was that kind of silence that hit me and my friends the moment we stepped into the abandoned campsite. The fire was out, but the ashes were still warm, like whoever had been here left in a hurry, without packing anything. There was no sign of life, and that's what unsettled us the most. We hadn't planned on finding the campsite. It wasn't marked on the map, and we were far off the main trails in the Colorado backcountry. Eric, my best friend since middle school, had convinced me, along with our other 2 friends, Ryan and Dave, to take this off-the-beaten-path adventure, just 4 of us, no crowds, no distractions, just nature. We wanted isolation, and that's exactly what we got. But as we stood there, staring at the scattered camping gear, the tent half collapsed, a backpack lying open, its contents spilling onto the ground, it didn't feel like the peaceful isolation we'd signed up for. "This doesn't feel right," Ryan muttered, kicking at the dirt near a tipped-over cooking pot. "Who leaves all their gear behind like this?" "Maybe they went for a hike and got lost," Eric suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Dave squatted near the fire pit, poking at the ashes. "These coals are still warm. They couldn't have left more than an hour ago." I glanced around, scanning the tree line that surrounded the clearing. The campsite was tucked into a small hollow, with dense forest pressing in on all sides. The air was thick with the smell of pine, but underneath it there was something else, something faint but sharp. A metallic scent, almost like copper. It hit the back of my throat, making me uneasy. "I don't like this," I said, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. "Something feels off." Eric gave me a look, that familiar smirk he always had when he thought I was being paranoid. "Come on, Jack. Don't go all horror movie on us. They probably just left in a rush. Maybe they got spooked by a bear." "A bear would have torn through the tent," Ryan countered, looking skeptically at the intact campsite. "This looks like someone just walked away." We stood there in tense silence for a moment, all of us feeling the same thing, but none of us wanting to say it out loud. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just that oppressive, suffocating silence. Then I noticed the footprints. They were faint but visible in the soft dirt around the tent, large, much larger than any human foot, and spaced too far apart to be a casual stride. My heart started to pound as I crouched down, tracing the outline with my fingers. "Guys, come look at this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric and Ryan stepped closer, peering down at the prints. Dave joined us, his brow furrowing as he studied them. "Those are too big to be human," Ryan said, his voice shaky, "and they're fresh." "Could be a bear," Eric said, though he didn't sound so sure anymore. "No way," Dave cut in, shaking his head. "Bears don't walk like that. And look at the shape. Too narrow for a bear. These are different." We followed the prints with our eyes as they trailed off into the woods, disappearing into the dense underbrush. My stomach churned with a growing sense of dread. Something was wrong. People don't just leave a campsite like this, not without taking their gear, not without a trace. "We should go," I said, standing up abruptly. "Whatever happened here, it's not our problem. Let's just head back to the main trail." For once, no one argued with me. We gathered our packs and started moving, the tension between us palpable. As we left the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My skin prickled, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. But there was nothing, just the trees, dark and silent. We moved quickly, trying to put distance between us and the abandoned campsite. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I kept my eyes on the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The sooner we got back to the main trail, the better. But then Eric stopped abruptly, his hand shooting up to signal us to stop. I nearly ran into him. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his eyes scanning the trees. We all stood still, listening. At first, I didn't hear anything, just the eerie silence of the forest. But then, faintly, I picked up on it. A rustling sound, soft but distinct, coming from somewhere behind us. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate. Something, or someone, was moving through the woods. "Keep walking," I muttered, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Don't look back." We started moving again, faster this time, our footsteps crunching on the forest floor. The rustling sound followed us, growing louder, closer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to run, but something told me that running would only make it worse. Then, out of nowhere, a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. We all froze, fear gripping us like a vice. "What the hell was that?" Ryan hissed, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Eric whispered, his bravado gone, "but we need to move. Now." We broke into a run, no longer caring about being quiet. The forest blurred around us as we sprinted down the narrow trail, the sound of something crashing through the underbrush behind us growing louder with every step. Whatever it was fast, and it was following us. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept running, the fear driving me forward. I could hear Dave panting behind me, Ryan cursing under his breath, and Eric just ahead, his footsteps pounding the dirt. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I skidded to a halt, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The others stopped too, turning back to look at the trail behind us. Silence. The forest was still again, the heavy quiet settling over us like a thick fog. Whatever had been following us was gone, or at least it wasn't making any noise anymore. "We need to get back to the car," I said, my voice trembling. "No more stops, just let's go." No one argued. We walked the rest of the way in silence. Our nerves shot, constantly glancing over our shoulders. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had us jumping out of our skins. But the growl, the rustling, it didn't return. It wasn't until we reached the parking lot, our car sitting alone in the fading light, that I finally felt like I could breathe again. We threw our packs into the back, none of us saying a word, and piled into the car. As I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, I glanced back at the trailhead one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw something tall, standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. But then it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. I didn't say anything, neither did anyone else. We drove back to town in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us. None of us ever talked about that day again. Not really. It was one of those things we just pretended didn't happen, but I knew deep down that whatever had been at that campsite, whatever had been following us, was still out there. And it wasn't finished. Story 8. I've captured countless images of wildlife in my career, but none haunt me like the ones from that moonlit night in the Cascade Mountains. What I thought would be a routine assignment turned into an encounter that challenged everything I thought I knew about nature and reality. My name is Emily, and this is the story of how a simple wildlife photography job led me to question the very boundaries of our world. As a wildlife photographer, I'm used to long, solitary nights in the wilderness, but this assignment was different from the start. A wildlife conservation group had hired me to document nocturnal animal behavior in a remote area of the Cascades. There had been reports of unusual activity, animals acting strangely, unexplained noises, and even a few alleged sightings of something unnatural. I'd laughed it off at first. Every forest has its local legends, its campfire stories, but the pay was good, and I was intrigued by the challenge of nighttime photography in such a rugged environment. I arrived at the designated area late in the afternoon, my 4x4 loaded with camping gear and camera equipment. The forest was dense, old-growth timber stretching as far as the eye could see. As I set up my tent and gear, I couldn't shake a feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to the usual unease of being alone in the wilderness and focused on my work. My plan was to spend the night in a photography blind, a small camouflaged shelter that would allow me to observe and photograph wildlife without disturbing them. I'd set it up on a ridge overlooking a small clearing, giving me a perfect vantage point. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, I settled into my blind. The forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush. I adjusted my camera, a top-of-the-line DSLR with a night vision lens, and prepared for a long night of observation. The first few hours were uneventful. I captured some nice shots of deer grazing in the moonlight, and even a fox slinking through the shadows. But as midnight approached, something changed. The forest grew unnaturally quiet. Even the insects seemed to have fallen silent. That's when I heard it, a sound unlike anything I'd ever encountered in my years of wildlife photography. It was a low, mournful howl, but not from any wolf or coyote I knew. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees and sending a chill down my spine. I raised my camera, scanning the tree line through my viewfinder. The night vision turned the world into shades of green, every shadow a potential subject. For several long minutes, nothing moved. Then, at the edge of the clearing, something emerged from the trees. At first, I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But as it moved into the moonlight, I realized I was looking at something impossible. The creature was tall, at least 8 feet, walking on 2 legs with an almost human gait. But there was nothing human about its proportions. Its arms were too long, hanging almost to the ground. Matted fur covered its body and its head. I couldn't make out clear features, but its eyes caught the moonlight, glowing with an eerie intelligence. My hands shook as I pressed the shutter button, the camera's rapid-fire clicks sounding impossibly loud in the silent forest. The creature's head snapped in my direction, those glowing eyes seeming to stare directly into my soul. For a moment that felt like an eternity. We stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, with a speed that defied its size, the creature turned and sprinted back into the forest, covering ground with impossible strides. I sat in my blind, heart pounding, trying to process what I'd just seen. It couldn't be real. It had to be a man in a suit or some kind of elaborate hoax. But deep down, I knew. The way it moved, the intelligence in those eyes. This was no costume, no hoax. With trembling hands, I reviewed the photos on my camera's display. Most were blurry, the creature's speed defying even my high-end equipment, but a few were clear enough to turn my blood to ice. The rest of the night passed in a blur of paranoia and adrenaline. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me jumping, convinced the creature was returning. But dawn came without further incident, the rising sun chasing away the shadows and some of my fear. As I packed up my gear, my mind raced. What should I do with the photos? Would anyone believe me? The rational part of my brain argued that I should delete them, pretend this never happened. But the photographer in me, the part that lived to document the unseen, knew I couldn't do that. Back in civilization, I threw myself into research. I scoured local legends, cryptozoology forums, and scientific journals. I found stories of similar sightings in the area going back decades, even centuries. The local Native American tribes had legends of tall, fur-covered beings that roamed the forests at night. But the more I dug, the more questions I had. If these creatures were real, how had they remained hidden for so long? How many were there? And most troublingly, were they aware of us in the same way we were becoming aware of them? I debated for weeks about what to do with the photos. Part of me wanted to share them with the world, to prove that there were still mysteries out there, things beyond our understanding. But another part of me feared what might happen if the wrong people got hold of this information. Would it lead to an invasion of the forest, people seeking to capture or kill these creatures? In the end, I decided to keep the photos to myself, at least for now. I couldn't bear the thought of being responsible for exposing these beings to the world before we were ready to understand them. But the experience changed me. Every time I go into the forest now, I see it differently. The shadows seem deeper, the unknown more present. I find myself listening for that unearthly howl, scanning the tree line for impossible shapes. I've returned to that spot in the Cascades several times since that night. I've never seen the creature again. But sometimes, when the moon is full and the forest is quiet, I feel those eyes watching me. And I wonder, are we the observers or the observed? As a photographer, my job is to capture reality, to show the world as it truly is. But that night in the Cascades taught me that reality is far stranger, far more wondrous and terrifying than we could ever imagine. There are things out there, just beyond the reach of our understanding, waiting to be discovered. So the next time you're in the wilderness and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, take a closer look. You might just capture something that changes everything you thought you knew about the world around us. And if you hear a howl that doesn't quite sound like any animal you know, if you see a shadow move in a way that defies explanation, remember my story. Remember that there are still mysteries in this world, still unknowns lurking just beyond the light of our campfires and the flash of our cameras. Because sometimes the most important things we capture are the ones that challenge our very perception of reality, and sometimes the true nature of our world is only revealed when we're brave enough to look through the lens of the unknown. Story 9. The scream that pierced the night wasn't human. I'd staked my career as a forest ranger on it, but it wasn't quite animal either. As the echo faded into the darkness, leaving behind an eerie silence, I knew my quiet night patrol had just become anything but ordinary. I'm Sarah Thompson, and I've been a ranger at Blackwood National Forest for over a decade. I thought I'd seen and heard it all, from lost hikers to aggressive wildlife, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that night. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where your breath hangs in the air like a ghost. The moon was full, casting long shadows through the trees. I was making my usual rounds, flashlight in hand, senses alert for any signs of trouble. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting. It was as if the entire woodland had collectively held its breath. That's when I heard it. A scream that started low and guttural before rising to a pitch that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't the cry of a mountain lion or the howl of a wolf. This was something different. My hand instinctively went to the radio at my hip, but I hesitated. What would I even say? Dispatch. I heard a weird noise. I'd never live it down. No, I needed more information before I called this in. I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Get it together, Sarah," I muttered. "You've got a job to do." Slowly, cautiously, I began to move in the direction of the sound. The fallen leaves crunched under my boots, each step sounding impossibly loud in the stillness of the night. I strained my ears, listening for any follow-up to that bone-chilling scream, but there was nothing. As I pushed deeper into the woods, away from the main trail, the underbrush became thicker. Branches snagged at my uniform, and more than once I had to duck to avoid low-hanging limbs. The beam of my flashlight danced over the forest floor, and that's when I saw it. A footprint, but not like any I'd ever seen before. I crouched down, my heart pounding in my chest. The print was enormous, easily twice the size of my own boot. It was vaguely human-shaped, but the toes were too long, ending in what looked like claw marks gouged into the soft earth. Whatever had made this print was heavy. The impression was deep, with clearly defined edges. "What the hell?" I whispered, reaching out to touch the edge of the print. The soil was still loose, not yet settled. This was fresh. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, a dark shape ducking behind a tree. But when I focused on the spot, there was nothing there. My mouth went dry. Logic told me it was probably just a deer or maybe a bear, but deep in my gut, I knew that wasn't the case. Whatever had made that footprint, whatever had let out that unearthly scream, it was something else entirely. I stood slowly, every muscle in my body tense. The forest seemed to press in around me, the shadows deeper and more menacing than before. I had the distinct feeling of being watched, of eyes boring into me from the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. Another snap, this time to my left. I jerked the light in that direction, my other hand moving to the pepper spray on my belt. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing against whatever was out there. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Ranger Thompson. Identify yourself." Silence was my only answer, but it was a loaded silence, pregnant with anticipation. I could almost feel the presence out there, watching, waiting. I took a step back, then another. My training told me to stand my ground, to assert authority, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. I compromised by slowly backing away, keeping my eyes and flashlight trained on the spot where I'd heard the noise. That's when I saw them. Eyes, reflecting the light of my flashlight. Two orbs glowed in the darkness. They were set too high to be a normal animal, at least 7 feet off the ground. And they were intelligent eyes, studying me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, me and whatever this creature was. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then slowly, deliberately, the eyes blinked. That broke the spell. I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. I could hear movement behind me, something large pushing through the forest with far more grace and speed than I could muster. My lungs burned as I gulped in the cold night air, legs pumping furiously as I sprinted back towards the main trail. I didn't dare look back. I was too afraid of what I might see gaining on me. As I burst out onto the trail, I fumbled for my radio. "Dispatch!" I gasped. "This is Ranger Thompson. I need backup at Sector 7 now." "Copy that, Ranger Thompson," came the crackled reply. "What's your situation?" I hesitated for a split second. How could I possibly explain what I'd just experienced? "Possible. Large predator," I finally managed. "Behaving aggressively. I'm retreating to the ranger station." "Understood. Backup is on the way. Stay safe. Sarah." I clicked off the radio and risked a glance over my shoulder. The trail behind me was empty, moonlight illuminating the path I'd just fled down, but the shadows between the trees seemed darker, more alive somehow. I could still feel those eyes on me. I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station, slamming the door behind me and leaning against it, gasping for breath. My colleagues found me there a few minutes later, wide-eyed and trembling. The next few hours were a blur of questions and explanations. I led a team back to where I'd seen the footprint, but it had been obliterated, whether by animal tracks or something else. I couldn't say. There was no sign of the large creature I'd encountered. No trace of those intelligent, terrifying eyes. Some of my co-workers were skeptical, others were concerned, wondering if I'd had some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But a few nodded knowingly, as if they'd been waiting for someone else to confirm what they'd suspected all along. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I found myself sitting on the porch of the ranger station, a cup of coffee cooling in my hands. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing, more familiar, but I knew I'd never look at it quite the same way again. I've been a ranger for a long time. I've seen bears that could crush a man with a swipe of their paw. I've faced down mountain lions and dealt with all manner of dangerous wildlife, but nothing in my training or experience had prepared me for what I encountered that night. Was it a Sasquatch, a Wendigo, some other creature that lurks in the shadows of our world, just beyond the reach of our understanding? I don't know, and part of me doesn't want to know. But I do know this. The next time I hear that scream in the night, I won't be going to investigate. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some shadows better left unexplored. And whatever is out there in the depths of Blackwood National Forest, watching and waiting, well, I hope it stays there, because the thought of it finding its way out into the world beyond the trees, that's a nightmare I'm not ready to face. As I finish my coffee and prepare for another day of patrols, I can't shake the feeling that things have changed. The forest has always had its secrets, but now I know it's keeping something bigger, something that defies explanation. And as I look out at the trees, their leaves rustling in the morning breeze, I wonder, is it watching me even now? Story 10. I used to think the most dangerous thing in a lake was the risk of drowning. That was before that twilight fishing trip with my brother changed everything. My name is Jake, and this is the story of how a peaceful evening on the water turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. Growing up in northern Minnesota, lakes were as much a part of our lives as the air we breathed. My younger brother Ryan and I spent countless summers swimming, boating, and fishing in the countless bodies of water that dotted the landscape. But Lake Whisper was different. It was deeper, darker, and more isolated than the others. Local legends spoke of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances, but we always laughed them off as campfire stories meant to scare tourists. If only we'd listened. It was late August, and Ryan and I decided to squeeze in one last fishing trip before he headed back to college. We chose Lake Whisper, hoping its remote location would mean fewer people and better fishing. As we loaded our small boat with gear, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. "You sure about this, Jake?" Ryan asked, noticing my hesitation. "We could always hit up Cedar Lake instead." I shook off the feeling and grinned at him. "Nah, we're already here. Besides, the big ones are always in the places nobody else goes, right? If I could go back to that moment, I'd slap myself and drive us straight home." But hindsight is always 20/20, and we pushed off from the shore, the old outboard motor sputtering to life. The lake was like glass as we made our way towards the center. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. It was the kind of evening that reminded you why you loved being outdoors. We cut the motor about a half-mile from shore and drifted, casting our lines into the dark water. For a while, it was perfect. We caught a few decent-sized bass, traded jokes, and talked about Ryan's upcoming semester. As the light faded, the fish seemed to get more active, and we decided to stay out a bit longer. That's when things started to get weird. It began with the loons. Their haunting calls are a common sound on northern lakes, but this was different. Their cries became frantic, almost panicked. Then, as suddenly as it started, they fell silent. The entire lake seemed to hold its breath. "Jake," Ryan whispered, his eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" I listened intently. At first, all I could hear was the gentle lapping of water against the boat. Then I heard it, a deep, rhythmic sound coming from beneath us. It was like breathing, but amplified and distorted by the water. It's probably just air escaping from the lake bed, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. These deep lakes do that sometimes. Ryan nodded, but I could see he wasn't convinced. Neither was I, if I'm being honest. The breathing sound grew louder, and I felt a subtle vibration through the boat. Something was moving down there, something big. My mind raced through possibilities, a school of large fish, a sudden current. But deep down, I knew it was none of those things. Maybe we should head back, Ryan suggested, reeling in his line. I was about to agree when I saw it, a dark shape moving just beneath the surface, far larger than any fish I'd ever seen. It was moving towards us, fast. "Start the motor!" I yelled, dropping my rod and scrambling towards the outboard. Ryan's face went pale as he saw the shape approaching. He yanked on the starter cord, but the old motor only sputtered and died. The shape was almost upon us now. In the fading light, I could make out a massive, elongated form. For a split second, I thought it might be a giant sturgeon. Then it breached the surface, and my world shattered. What rose from the water was no fish. It was vaguely humanoid, but massive, easily twice the size of a man. Its skin was a mottled grey-green, slick with algae and lake weeds. Long, powerful arms ended in webbed hands with wicked claws. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come, a twisted blend of human and amphibian features, with large, unblinking eyes and a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth. Time seemed to slow down. I saw every detail with horrifying clarity, the way its gills fluttered as it breathed the air, the intelligence in those inhuman eyes as they fixed on us. It let out a roar that was part bellow, part gurgle, spraying us with lake water and the stench of rotting fish. "Go!" I screamed, abandoning the motor and grabbing an oar. Ryan did the same, and we began paddling frantically towards the shore. The creature dove back under the surface, but I could see its dark shape pacing our boat. It was toying with us, I realized with growing horror. This thing, whatever it was intelligent. We were about halfway to shore when it struck. The boat lurched violently, nearly capsizing us. Clawed hands gripped the sides, and slowly, deliberately, the creature began to rise from the water again. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I swung the oar with all my might, connecting solidly with the thing's head. It let out a shriek of pain and rage, momentarily letting go of the boat. "Keep paddling!" I yelled to Ryan, who was frozen in terror. "Don't stop no matter what!" We redoubled our efforts, our arms burning with exertion. I could hear splashing behind us, knew the creature was giving chase, but I didn't dare look back. Finally, mercifully, I felt the boat scrape against the rocky shore. We leaped out, scrambling up the bank. Only then did I turn to look at the lake. The creature was there, at the edge of the shallows, half submerged. It made no move to come after us on land, but those eyes followed us with an intelligence that chilled me to my core. It let out one more roar, a sound of frustration and hunger, before sinking back into the depths. Ryan and I didn't speak as we ran to the car. We didn't speak on the drive home. It wasn't until we were safely locked in my apartment, a bottle of whiskey between us, that we tried to process what we'd seen. What was that thing?" Ryan finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, taking a long drink. "I don't know. I don't want to know." But of course, that wasn't true. In the weeks and months that followed, I became obsessed with finding an explanation. I researched cryptozoology, local legends, even reached out to marine biologists under the guise of writing a book. I found stories of similar creatures in lakes and rivers around the world. The Ogopogo in Canada, the Bunyip in Australia, the Vodyanoi in Slavic countries. Had we encountered some kind of living fossil, a creature thought long extinct? Was it some kind of undiscovered amphibian that had grown to monstrous size in the depths of Lake Whisper? Or was it something else entirely, something that defied scientific explanation? I never went back to Lake Whisper, but I couldn't stay away from the water entirely. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I find myself drawn to the shores of other lakes. I stand there, watching the sun set, and I wonder, how many other secrets are hiding beneath the surface of our world? How many other creatures are out there, just beyond the reach of our understanding? Ryan and I made a pact never to speak of what we saw that night. Who would believe us anyway? But sometimes, when we're together and the conversation lulls, I catch him staring out at the water with a look of mingled fear and wonder. I know he's remembering too. So the next time you're out on a lake, enjoying the peace and tranquility of the water, remember this. We are not alone. There are things out there, ancient things, powerful things, that we can scarcely comprehend. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just catch a glimpse of them. Just pray that a glimpse is all you get. Because once you've seen what lurks beneath the surface, you can never unsee it. And you'll never look at a lake the same way again. Story 11. I never believed in Bigfoot. Not really. Sure, I'd watch those cheesy documentaries with my son, Tommy, and we'd laugh at the blurry footage and far-fetched theories. But that was before our camping trip to Shadow Pine Forest, before the night that changed everything. My name's Mike Harrington, and I'm just an ordinary guy, an accountant from Seattle who likes to get away from the spreadsheets and into nature when I can. Tommy had just turned 12, and I figured it was high time for a father-son camping trip. Just the two of us, roughing it in the great outdoors. I chose Shadow Pine Forest for our adventure. It was remote enough to feel wild, but not so far off the beaten path that I'd worry about our safety. At least, that's what I thought. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind the towering pines. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Tommy was buzzing with excitement, his eyes wide as he took in the massive trees and the quiet that seemed to blanket everything. "Dad, did you know this area is famous for Sasquatch sightings?" Tommy asked as we set up our tent. I chuckled, driving a stake into the ground. "Is that so? Well, let's hope he doesn't snore too loud and keep us up all night." Tommy grinned, but I noticed his eyes darting to the tree line. "You don't really think they're real, do you, Dad?" I ruffled his hair. "Nah, buddy, it's just stories people tell to make the woods seem more exciting. Now, how about we get a fire going and roast some hot dogs?" The evening passed pleasantly. We ate our hot dogs, made s'mores, and I told Tommy some of the tamer ghost stories I remembered from my own childhood camping trips. As the fire died down to embers, we crawled into our tent, the sounds of the forest lulling us to sleep. I'm not sure what time it was when I first heard it, a heavy rustling like something large moving through the underbrush. In my groggy state, I assumed it was a deer or maybe a bear nosing around our campsite. "Dad," Tommy's whisper cut through the darkness. "Did you hear that?" "It's probably just an animal, buddy," I murmured, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Go back to sleep." But sleep didn't come. The rustling continued, punctuated by what sounded like heavy footsteps. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was circling our campsite. I sat up, my heart pounding. Tommy pressed close to me, his small body trembling. "Dad, I'm scared," he whispered. "It's okay," I said, wrapping an arm around him. "We're safe in here." But even as I said it, I wasn't so sure. The footsteps grew closer, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold, a low, rumbling growl that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. This sound was deeper, almost human-like, but with a wildness that sent shivers down my spine. Tommy whimpered, burying his face in my side. I reached for the flashlight with shaking hands, debating whether to turn it on. Would the light scare off whatever was out there, or would it provoke it? Before I could decide, something heavy slammed into the side of our tent. Tommy let out a yelp, and I instinctively pulled him closer. The fabric of the tent bulged inward, and for a horrifying moment, I thought it would tear. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound authoritative despite the fear gripping my chest. "Get out of here!" My shout was met with another growl, louder this time. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the pressure on the tent released. We heard more rustling, the sound of something large moving away from our campsite. For what felt like hours, Tommy and I sat there in the darkness, hardly daring to breathe. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us flinching. I kept the flashlight clutched in my hand, ready to use it as a weapon if needed. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, I finally felt it was safe enough to venture outside. "Stay here," I told Tommy, zipping him into the sleeping bag. "I'm going to take a look around." The morning air was chilly as I unzipped the tent and stepped out. At first glance, everything looked normal. The trees stood silent, the early morning mist giving the forest an ethereal quality. But as I scanned our campsite, my heart sank. Our cooler, which I'd foolishly left out, was on its side, its contents strewn across the ground. Packages were torn open, food crushed and scattered, but it wasn't the mess that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the footprints. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own foot, and they were distinctly humanoid, with 5 toes clearly visible in the soft earth. But no human could have left prints that large. "Dad!" Tommy's voice made me jump. He was standing at the entrance of the tent, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. "What happened?" I opened my mouth to offer some rational explanation, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain this? Tommy's gaze fell on the footprints, and I saw the color drain from his face. Is that what I think it is? I wanted to tell him no, to come up with some logical reason for what we were seeing, but I couldn't lie to him. Not about this. "I don't know, buddy," I said, my voice hoarse. "But whatever it was, it's gone now." We spent the next hour cleaning up the campsite in silence, both of us jumpy at every sound from the forest. As I picked up a crushed soda can, I noticed something stuck to it, a tuft of coarse, reddish-brown hair. My hands shook as I examined it. It wasn't like any animal fur I'd ever seen. It was thicker, almost human-like, but definitely not human. "Dad!" Tommy's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. "Can we go home now?" I nodded, shoving the hair into my pocket. "Yeah, buddy. Let's pack up." We broke camp in record time, both of us eager to put as much distance between us and Shadow Pine Forest as possible. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking figure, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. I kept replaying the night's events in my mind, trying to find a rational explanation. But every scenario I came up with fell short of explaining what we'd experienced. "Dad!" Tommy's voice broke the silence as we neared Seattle. "Do you think it was really, Bigfoot?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter, choosing my words carefully. "I don't know, Tommy. I really don't. But whatever it was something I've never encountered before." Tommy nodded, looking out the window at the passing landscape. "I'm glad we're going home," he said softly. "But part of me wishes we could have seen it. For real." I couldn't help but smile at that. Even after a terrifying night, his curiosity and sense of adventure were still intact. "Maybe next time, buddy," I said, though I wasn't sure if there would be a next time. At least not in Shadow Pine Forest. As we pulled into our driveway, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. We were home, safe. The events of the night already felt like a distant dream, but later that evening, as I emptied my pockets, I found the tuft of hair I'd discovered at the campsite. I held it up to the light, studying its unusual texture and color. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that our encounter in the woods wasn't just a bad dream or a product of overactive imaginations. Something had visited our campsite that night. Something large, powerful, and unknown to science. And while part of me wanted to forget the whole incident, to file it away as a bizarre, one-time occurrence, I knew I couldn't, because now I knew that the forests held secrets, creatures that lurked just beyond the reach of our understanding. And while I wasn't eager to go searching for another encounter, I couldn't deny the thrill of knowing that there was still mystery in the world, still things that defied explanation. As I tucked the hair away in a small box, I made a silent promise to myself. I would keep an open mind. I would listen to the stories of others who claimed to have seen something in the woods. And maybe, just maybe, I'd gather the courage to venture back into Shadow Pine Forest one day, because now I knew the truth. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it, it wasn't just a legend. It was out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness, waiting to be discovered. And that knowledge, as terrifying as it was, also filled me with a sense of wonder I hadn't felt since I was Tommy's age. The world, it seemed, was a far more mysterious and exciting place than I had ever imagined, and our camping trip, scary as it was, had opened my eyes to possibilities I never would have considered before. As I turned out the light that night, I found myself looking forward to our next adventure, wherever it might lead us. Story 12. I've guided hundreds of hikers through the Appalachian wilderness, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror that awaited us on the Whispering Pine Trail. What began as a routine day hike turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. My name is Lisa, and this is the story of how a simple nature walk became a fight for survival against something that shouldn't exist. It was early October, the perfect time for hiking in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the landscape in vibrant reds and golds. I had a small group with me that day, just 4 hikers, all experienced outdoors enthusiasts looking to explore one of the less traveled trails in the area. There was Mike, a retired teacher with a passion for birdwatching, Sarah and Tom, a young couple celebrating their anniversary, and Dave, a gruff ex-military type who'd hiked with me before. We met at the trailhead early that morning, the air crisp and full of promise. "All right, folks," I said, going through my usual pre-hike briefing. "The Whispering Pine Trail is about 8 miles round trip. It's not the easiest hike, but the views at the summit are worth it. Stay together, watch your footing, and let me know if you need a break." We set off in high spirits, the forest around us coming alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. The trail was narrow and winding, cutting through dense stands of pine and old-growth hardwoods. As we climbed higher, the trees seemed to grow older, more gnarled. The light, filtering through the canopy, took on an odd greenish tinge. About 2 hours into the hike, I noticed something strange. The trail markers, which had been clearly visible and well maintained at the start, were becoming harder to find. Some looked weathered beyond their years. Others seemed to have been deliberately obscured. "Hey, Lisa," Dave called from the back of the group. "You sure we're still on the right path? Something feels off." I tried to hide my growing unease. "It's an old trail," I said, forcing a smile. "Probably just needs some maintenance. We're heading in the right direction." But as we pressed on, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. The forest had gone quiet. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving us in an eerie silence broken only by our own footsteps and labored breathing. That's when I saw the footprints. At first I thought they might belong to a bear. They were large and deeply pressed into the soft earth of the trail. But as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. They were vaguely human in shape, but far too large, with long, claw-like toes. "What kind of animal made those?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Probably just a bear," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's keep moving. We don't want to hang around if there's wildlife in the area." We picked up the pace, the silence of the forest now oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, followed. Every shadow seemed to move. Every tree trunk could be hiding something just out of sight. The trail began to narrow, hemmed in by thick undergrowth on both sides. The trees loomed over us, their branches intertwining above to block out most of the sunlight. It felt less like a forest and more like a tunnel, leading us deeper into the unknown. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We all froze, instinctively huddling closer together. "What was that?" Tom whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Before I could answer, we heard it again, closer this time. It was unlike any animal sound I'd ever heard, too deep for a bear, too guttural for a mountain lion. And underneath it all, there was an almost human quality that sent shivers down my spine. "We need to move," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Now stay close together." We started back down the trail, moving as quickly as we dared on the uneven ground. The growling continued, sometimes fading into the distance, sometimes so close it felt like it was right behind us. As we rounded a bend in the trail, Mike let out a strangled gasp. There, not 20 feet ahead of us, stood something that defied explanation. It was tall, at least 8 feet, covered in matted dark fur. Its limbs were long and powerful, ending in hands with wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that turned my blood to ice, a twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stood frozen, staring at the creature. It tilted its head, studying us with those terrible eyes. Then it opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and let out a roar that shook the very trees around us. "Run!" I screamed, breaking the spell of terror that had gripped us. We turned and fled back up the trail, blind panic driving us forward. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind us, its growls now mixed with a horrible, guttural sound that was almost like speech. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. The trail seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't remember, leading us deeper into the forest instead of back to safety. Branches whipped at our faces, roots threatened to trip us with every step. Finally, gasping for breath, we burst into a small clearing. To my horror, I realized we were completely lost. The trail had disappeared, and the forest around us was unfamiliar and foreboding. What was that thing?" Sarah sobbed, clinging to Tom. "I don't know," I admitted, my mind reeling. "I've never seen anything like it." Dave, his military training kicking in, took charge. "We need to find high ground, try to get our bearings, and we need to be ready to defend ourselves." We fashioned makeshift weapons from fallen branches, though I doubted they'd do much good against the creature we'd seen. As the light began to fade, we made our way to a rocky outcropping that offered some protection and a view of the surrounding forest. Night fell, bringing with it a chorus of unfamiliar sounds. Strange howls and cries echoed through the trees, and more than once we heard the snap of branches nearby, as if something large was circling our position. We huddled together, exhausted and terrified, taking turns to keep watch. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. I couldn't help but think of all the stories I'd dismissed over the years, tales of Bigfoot, of wild men in the mountains, of things that lurked just beyond the edge of civilization. How many of them were true? As dawn broke, we made a desperate attempt to find our way back. We stumbled through the forest, jumping at every sound, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. By some miracle, we eventually found a trail that led us back to civilization, though it wasn't the one we'd started on. We never spoke publicly about what happened on the Whispering Pine Trail. Who would believe us? But that experience changed me forever. I still work as a guide, but I'm more cautious now, more aware of the secrets the wilderness might hold. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I think I hear that growl again, and I wonder, what else is out there, just beyond the reach of our flashlights and campfires? What ancient things still roam the wild places of the world? So the next time you're hiking a lonely trail and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, pay attention. The wilderness is vast, and we understand so little of it. There are things out there, things that defy explanation, things that challenge everything we think we know about the world. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just come face to face with them. Just pray that, unlike us, you're able to find your way back to safety, because once you've glimpsed what lurks in the shadows of the forest, you can never unsee it. And you'll never walk a lonely trail again without wondering what might be watching you from just beyond the trees. Story 13. I've always believed that a photograph captures more than just an image. It captures a moment in time, a slice of reality, frozen forever. But on that crisp autumn day in the Cascade Mountains, my camera captured something that shook my understanding of reality to its core. My name is Emily Lawson, and I'm a wildlife photographer. I've spent years traipsing through forests, wading through swamps, and scaling mountains to get the perfect shot of nature in all its raw beauty. But nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I encountered in those misty woods. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, capturing the vibrant fall colors of the Pacific Northwest for a nature magazine. I'd been hiking since dawn, my trusty Canon slung around my neck, waiting for that perfect combination of light and landscape. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows through the trees, I found myself in a small clearing. The light was perfect, golden rays filtering through the crimson and amber leaves, creating a scene that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. I raised my camera, adjusting the focus, and began to shoot. Click, click, click. I was so engrossed in capturing the scene before me that I almost missed it. A movement in the corner of my eye, just at the edge of the frame. Instinctively, I swung my camera towards it, finger still on the shutter button. Click. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. The forest was still, silent except for the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. But something made me pause, made me lower my camera and review the last few shots. The first few were as expected, stunning autumnal landscapes that would make any editor swoon. But the last one, my blood ran cold as I stared at the small LCD screen. There, partially obscured by a large oak tree, was a figure. But not just any figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and covered in what looked like thick, dark fur. The image was slightly blurred due to the movement, but I could make out a distinctly ape-like face, with deep-set eyes that seemed to stare right through the camera lens and into my soul. My hands started to shake, and I nearly dropped the camera. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe a hiker in a costume. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Whatever I had captured on film was something else. I looked up sharply, scanning the tree line where I'd seen the movement. The forest suddenly seemed darker, more oppressive. The silence that had seemed peaceful just moments ago now felt heavy with anticipation. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear or any other animal I'd encountered in my years of wildlife photography. This sound was deeper, almost guttural, with an almost human-like quality that sent shivers down my spine. My heart pounding in my chest, I slowly began to back away, my eyes darting from tree to tree. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking figure, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. I wanted to run, to sprint back down the trail to the safety of my car, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. As I reached the edge of the clearing, my back pressed against the rough bark of a pine tree, I saw it. Just for a moment, a dark shape moved between two distant trees. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, moving with a grace that belied its size. I raised my camera on instinct, years of training overriding my fear. But by the time I had focused, the shape was gone, leaving me with nothing but the pounding of my heart and the rustling of leaves in the wind. For a long moment, I stood there, my finger hovering over the shutter button, waiting for the figure to reappear. But the forest had fallen silent again, as if nothing had happened. With shaking hands, I lowered my camera and took a deep breath. I needed to get out of there, to get back to civilization and examine what I'd captured. But more than that, I needed to make sense of what I'd just experienced. The hike back to my car was a blur of paranoia and adrenaline. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide some unknown threat. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the empty gravel expanse. I practically dove into my car, locking the doors behind me. As I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a pair of eyes gleaming in the growing darkness, but there was nothing, just the empty lot and the looming forest beyond. The drive back to Seattle was a quiet one. I kept replaying the incident in my mind, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Could it have been a bear standing on its hind legs, a hiker in an elaborate costume? Or was it something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in our world of science and reason? By the time I reached my small apartment, my hands had stopped shaking, but my mind was still racing. I immediately went to my computer, eager to upload the photos and see if the image I'd glimpsed on my camera's small screen was really what I thought it was. As the photos loaded, I held my breath. The first few were as I remembered. Beautiful landscape shots that would have normally filled me with pride. But then I reached the last one, the one I'd taken just as I noticed the movement. My heart skipped a beat. There it was, partially hidden behind a tree, but unmistakable. A large, bipedal creature covered in dark fur. The face was blurred due to movement, but I could make out deep-set eyes and a pronounced brow ridge. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Not quite ape, not quite human, but something in between. I zoomed in, scrutinizing every pixel. Part of me hoped to find some flaw, some telltale sign of a hoax or misidentification. But the more I looked, the more convinced I became. This was real. I had captured something on camera that shouldn't exist. As I sat there, staring at my computer screen, a mix of emotions washed over me. Fear, certainly. The memory of that low growl still sent shivers down my spine. But there was something else too. Excitement, wonder. I'd always dreamed of capturing something truly extraordinary, of making a discovery that would shake the foundations of what we thought we knew about the natural world. And now, it seemed, I had done just that. But what to do with this information? I knew that if I went public with the photo, I'd be met with skepticism at best, ridicule at worst. The scientific community would demand evidence beyond a single, somewhat blurry photograph. And the cryptozoology community, well, they'd probably hail me as a hero, but that came with its own set of problems. As the night wore on, I found myself torn between two impulses. Part of me wanted to share my discovery with the world, to prove once and for all that there were still mysteries out there waiting to be uncovered. But another part of me, a quieter, more contemplative part, wondered if some secrets were better left uncovered. I thought about the creature I'd seen, how it moved with such grace and purpose through the forest. It had clearly managed to stay hidden for centuries, eluding definitive proof of its existence. Was it right for me to expose it to the world, to subject it to the scrutiny and potential danger that would come with discovery? As the first light of dawn began to filter through my window, I made my decision. I carefully backed up the photo to several secure locations, then removed it from my camera's memory card. The magazine would get their beautiful autumn landscapes, but this would remain my secret, at least for now. In the years since that day in the Cascades, I've returned to those woods many times. I've never seen the creature again, never managed to capture another photo. But sometimes, when the light is just right and the forest is quiet, I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, and I'll smile, knowing that out there, beyond the reach of our modern world, there are still wonders waiting to be discovered. My encounter changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that our world is far more mysterious and magical than we give it credit for. Now, Every time I raise my camera, I'm not just looking to capture a beautiful image. I'm looking for that hint of the unknown, that glimpse of something beyond our understanding. Because now I know the truth. There are creatures out there that defy explanation, beings that blur the line between legend and reality. And while I may never capture another photo like the one from that fateful day, I'll never stop looking. Because in a world where Bigfoot can exist, anything is possible. And that, more than any photograph, is the true gift I received in those misty mountains. Story 14. I've tracked game through these woods for 30 years, but nothing could have prepared me for the day I became the hunted. My name is Dave, and this is the story of how a routine deer hunt turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. It was early November, the heart of deer season in the northern Rockies. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. I'd been up before dawn, my trusty rifle slung over my shoulder, following what I thought were promising deer tracks. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush and the soft crunch of my boots on fallen leaves. I'd been tracking for hours, moving deeper into the wilderness than I usually ventured, but I was confident in my skills and my knowledge of these woods. As the sun climbed higher, I began to notice something odd about the tracks I was following. They were deer-like, but not quite right. The stride was too long, the impressions too deep. I chalked it up to a particularly large buck and pressed on, my hunter's instinct overriding any sense of unease. It was nearing midday when I entered a small clearing. What I saw there stopped me dead in my tracks. In the center of the clearing was a collection of animal carcasses, arranged in a way that was decidedly unnatural. Deer, elk, even a bear, all positioned in a rough circle, their glassy eyes seeming to stare accusingly at me. My first thought was that I'd stumbled upon some kind of sick hunting camp. But as I approached, I realized these kills were fresh, too fresh, and the way they'd been opened, it wasn't the work of any hunter I'd ever known. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, rifle at the ready, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "This isn't funny." The only response was another growl, closer this time. I caught a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but years of hunting experience told me that would be a mistake. Whatever was out there, running would only trigger its predatory instincts. So I stood my ground, rifle raised, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it, a pair of eyes reflecting the midday sun, set much higher than any animal I'd ever encountered. They blinked once, and I realized with growing horror that they were looking right at me. Slowly, deliberately, a massive form began to emerge from the shadows of the forest. At first, I thought it must be a bear, standing on its hind legs. But as it moved into the clearing, I realized I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. It was tall, at least 8 feet, covered in dark, matted fur. Its body was powerfully built, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. But it was the face that turned my blood to ice, a twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, with eyes that held an unsettling intelligence. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I could see my own terrified reflection in those inhuman eyes. Then slowly, its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth. It let out a roar that shook the very ground beneath my feet. Instinct took over. I raised my rifle and fired, the crack of the shot echoing through the clearing. The creature staggered back, more surprised than hurt. Before I could chamber another round, it charged. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with a desperate speed I didn't know I possessed. behind me. I could hear the creature giving chase, its heavy footfalls and guttural roars spurring me on. I ran blindly, with no thought but escape. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me with every step. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that mad dash through the forest. But eventually, I burst out onto a logging road. Without hesitation, I turned and followed it, praying it would lead me back to civilization. The sounds of pursuit faded, but I didn't slow down. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing on the gravel road, gasping for breath. As I lay there, the reality of what I'd just experienced began to sink in. What was that thing? Some kind of undiscovered species, a creature out of legend come to life. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It took me hours to find my way back to my truck. By then, night was falling, casting long shadows that seemed to move and shift in ways that made my skin crawl. I drove home in a daze, jumping at every shadow on the road. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear, deformed or diseased in some way. Maybe the stress and solitude of the hunt had caused me to hallucinate. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I'd seen out there was real, and it defied any explanation I could come up with. I reported the incident to the local Forest Service, leaving out the more fantastic elements of my encounter. They found the clearing with the arranged carcasses, but there was no sign of the creature. The official report chalked it up to an illegal hunting operation and unusual predator behavior. I've been back to those woods since that day, drawn by a mix of fear and fascination. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes, when the wind is right, I catch a whiff of that same musky odor I smelled in the clearing. And on quiet nights, I swear I can hear distant roars echoing through the valleys. The experience changed me. I still hunt, but I'm more cautious now, more aware of the secrets the wilderness might hold. I find myself watching the shadows, listening for sounds that don't belong. And I wonder, how many other hunters have encountered something out there that they can't explain? How many have become the prey without even realizing it? I've researched similar sightings, delved into local legends and folklore. There are stories of creatures like the one I saw scattered throughout history, across cultures. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the Wendigo, different names for something that lurks just beyond the edge of our understanding. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat. The memory of those intelligent eyes and sharp teeth as vivid as the day it happened. I find myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. If this creature exists, what else might be out there? So the next time you're in the wilderness, whether you're hunting, hiking, or just enjoying nature, remember this. We are not always at the top of the food chain. There are things out there, ancient things, powerful things that we can scarcely comprehend. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just come face to face with them. Just pray that if you do, you're faster, smarter, or luckier than I was. Because once you've seen what lurks in the shadows of the forest, you can never unsee it. And you'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. The woods are vast, and we understand so little of what lives within them. So tread carefully, listen closely, and always be prepared. Because out there, in the wild places of the world, you never know when you might stop being the hunter and become the hunted. Story 15. The moment I saw that massive footprint in the mud, I knew this hunting trip was about to become something else entirely. Something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the wilderness I'd called home for decades. My name is John Hawkins, and I've been a hunter in these parts of northern Michigan for over 30 years. I've tracked deer, elk, and bear through every inch of these woods. I thought I knew every creature that called this forest home. But that day, as the early morning mist clung to the pines, I realized how wrong I'd been. It was the opening day of deer season, and I'd set out before dawn, my trusty rifle slung over my shoulder. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. As I made my way along a familiar game trail, something caught my eye, a depression in the soft ground beside a small creek. At first, I thought it might be a bear track, but as I crouched down to examine it, my breath caught in my throat. This print was easily twice the size of any bear track I'd ever seen. And its shape, it was undeniably humanoid-y, with 5 distinct toe impressions. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Could it be a hoax? Some prankster with oversized feet stomping around the woods? But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The print was too perfect, too natural in its formation. As I stood there, the hairs on the back of my neck started to rise. I had the distinct feeling of being watched. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, had gone eerily quiet. That's when I saw it. Another print, then another, leading away from the creek and deeper into the forest. Without really thinking about it, I shouldered my rifle and began to follow the trail. The tracks led me off any path I'd known, deeper into a part of the forest I'd rarely ventured. The trees grew denser, the underbrush thicker. Twice I nearly lost the trail, only to pick it up again a few yards later. As I pushed through a particularly dense thicket, I stumbled into a small clearing. And there, at the base of a massive oak tree, I saw it, the entrance to a cave, partially hidden by overgrown vines and fallen branches. My heart was pounding now, a mix of excitement and fear coursing through my veins. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn back, to forget what I'd seen and return to the familiar comfort of my deer stand. But curiosity, that dangerous and intoxicating force, pushed me forward. As I approached the cave entrance, I noticed something that made me pause. There, carved into the trunk of the oak tree, were deep gouges, claw marks. But unlike any I'd ever seen, they were too high up for a bear, too deep and wide for a mountain lion. Whatever had made these marks was large, powerful, and equipped with claws that could easily rend flesh from bone. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom of the cave entrance. The air that wafted out was cool and damp, carrying a musky animal scent that I couldn't quite place. "Hello," I called out, immediately feeling foolish. What was I expecting? A response in English. My voice echoed back at me, bouncing off unseen walls deep within the cave. And then, carried on that echo, I heard something else. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. Every instinct I had honed over decades in the wilderness screamed at me to run, but I stood my ground, my rifle now clutched tightly in sweaty palms. I swept the flashlight beam deeper into the cave, revealing rough stone walls that glistened with moisture. That's when I saw them, the claw marks. They covered the walls, floor to ceiling, some fresh enough that small flakes of stone still clung to the gouges. My mind reeled, trying to imagine a creature large enough and powerful enough to leave such marks. I took a tentative step into the cave, then another. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the musty smell grew stronger. I could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness ahead, the sound echoing ominously. As I moved deeper into the cave, my flashlight beam caught something on the ground. I crouched down to examine it, my heart racing. It was a bone, large, possibly from a deer or elk. But it wasn't the bone itself that made my blood run cold. It was the teeth marks scored deep into its surface. Whatever had eaten this animal had jaws powerful enough to crack the bone like it was a toothpick. I stood quickly, suddenly very aware of how vulnerable I was. The cave entrance now seemed miles away, a tiny pinprick of light in the engulfing darkness. I turned to leave, to get out of this place that suddenly felt so alien and dangerous. That's when I heard it, a shuffling sound, like something large moving in the darkness ahead. My flashlight beam danced wildly as my hand shook, illuminating more claw-marked walls, more scattered bones. And then, for just a moment, the beam caught a pair of eyes reflecting in the darkness. They were set high, much higher than any animal I knew, and they were intelligent eyes. studying me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the damp cave floor as I scrambled towards the entrance. I could hear something moving behind me, heavy footfalls that seemed to shake the very ground. I burst out of the cave into the clearing, gasping for breath. Without looking back, I plunged into the forest, crashing through underbrush, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and arms. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that when I finally stopped, leaning against a tree as I fought to catch my breath, I was hopelessly lost. As my panic subsided, I forced myself to think rationally. I was an experienced woodsman. I could find my way back. But as I checked my compass and began to orient myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trek back to my truck was tense, every snapping twig and rustling leaf setting my nerves on edge. By the time I reached the familiar logging road where I'd parked, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. As I drove home, my mind raced with questions. What had I seen in that cave? What creature could leave tracks and claw marks like that? Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as a product of an overactive imagination, fueled by too many late-night Bigfoot documentaries. But I knew what I'd seen. Those eyes in the darkness. They weren't something I could simply explain away. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself obsessively researching cryptozoology and local legends. I read about Sasquatch sightings in the area, about Native American stories of wild men in the woods. The more I read, the more convinced I became that I had stumbled upon something extraordinary. I've been back to those woods many times since that day. I've never found the cave again. It's as if the forest itself has conspired to hide it from me. But sometimes, when I'm sitting in my deer stand in the pre-dawn darkness, I'll hear a sound that doesn't quite fit. A branch breaking under a weight too heavy for any known animal in these parts. A low, rumbling growl that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And I'll smile because I know the truth now. These forests hold secrets, ancient, primal secrets that defy our modern understanding of the world. There are creatures out there that blur the line between legend and reality, beings that have managed to stay hidden from human eyes for centuries. I don't hunt much anymore. These days, I prefer to sit quietly in the woods, my camera ready instead of my rifle, because I know that somewhere out there, watching from the shadows, is a creature that could change everything we think we know about the natural world, and maybe, just maybe, I'll be the one to finally prove its existence. But even if I never see it again, even if I never manage to capture that elusive evidence, I'll always have the memory of that day in the cave, the day I came face to face with the unknown and walked away forever changed. Because now I know the truth. The wilderness is far more wild, far more mysterious than we could ever imagine. And that knowledge, as terrifying as it can be, is also incredibly thrilling. It reminds me that even in our modern world of smartphones and satellites, there are still wonders out there waiting to be discovered. And who knows, maybe someday I'll find that cave again. And this time, I'll be ready for whatever emerges from the darkness. Story 16. I used to think the scariest thing about my morning runs was the possibility of twisting an ankle on a hidden route. That was before the day I encountered something in the woods that defied explanation and turned my world upside down. My name is Karen, and this is the story of how a routine jog became a terrifying chase that still haunts my dreams. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind that makes you glad to be alive. The sun was just beginning to peek through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest trail I'd run hundreds of times before. I'd moved to this small town on the edge of the national forest for precisely these moments. The solitude, the connection with nature, the gentle challenge of the winding path. I set out at my usual pace, my breath creating small clouds in the cool air, The forest was waking up around me, birds calling to each other, small animals rustling in the underbrush. It was perfect, peaceful. I had no idea that in less than an hour my perception of reality would be shattered forever. About 2 miles into my run, I noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the forest had dimmed, replaced by an eerie silence. I slowed my pace, suddenly aware of how alone I was out here. That's when I saw the first tree. It was an old oak, its trunk easily 4 feet in diameter. What caught my eye were the marks, deep gouges in the bark, far too high to have been made by any normal animal. They looked almost like claw marks, but huge, each groove deep enough to fit my hand into. "What the hell?" I muttered, reaching out to touch the scarred bark. As I traced the marks with my fingers, a chill ran down my spine. Whatever had made these was big, really big, and judging by the freshness of the exposed wood, it had been here recently. I looked around, suddenly feeling exposed. The trails stretched out before and behind me, disappearing into the misty morning shadows. For the first time since I'd started running these woods, I felt like an intruder. I should have turned back then, should have listened to the little voice in my head screaming that something was wrong. But curiosity got the better of me. I continued down the trail, my pace slower now, eyes scanning the surrounding trees. It didn't take long to find more marked trees. Some had claw marks like the first, others looked like they'd been struck by something immensely strong, leaving splintered gouges in the trunks. With each new discovery, the knot of fear in my stomach grew tighter. I was so focused on the trees that I almost missed the footprint. Almost. But there it was, pressed deep into a patch of mud just off the trail. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with long, claw-like toes. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A bear, maybe, but I knew bears didn't leave prints like this. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in these woods, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Slowly, carefully, I turned to look behind me. At first, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then, a movement caught my eye. Something large and dark was moving through the forest, partially obscured by the morning mist and the thick undergrowth. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I remained rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The shape moved again, and for a brief moment I caught a clear glimpse of what was stalking me. It was tall, far taller than any man, covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were long, hanging almost to the ground, ending in hands with wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that turned my blood to ice, a twisted mix of human and animal features, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. Our gazes met. And in that moment, I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. This creature was real, and it was hunting me. The spell broke. I turned and ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life. Behind me, I heard a roar that shook the very air, followed by the sound of something massive crashing through the underbrush. I flew down the trail, my feet barely seeming to touch the ground. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but terror kept me moving. I could hear it behind me, getting closer with each passing second. In desperation, I veered off the trail, hoping to lose it in the denser forest. I leaped over fallen logs, ducked under low-hanging branches, my lungs burning, my legs screaming for rest, but I didn't dare slow down. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, hear its guttural grunts as it pursued me. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that frantic chase, but eventually, mercifully, I burst out of the tree line and onto the road that led back to town. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw the creature hesitate at the edge of the forest, those terrifying eyes fixed on me. For a moment, We stared at each other across the divide between its world and mine. Then, with a final bone-chilling roar, it turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest. I didn't stop running until I reached my house, slamming and locking the door behind me. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from what I'd just experienced. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I researched local legends, delved into cryptozoology forums, even reached out to wildlife experts under the guise of writing a book. I found stories of similar creatures scattered throughout history and across cultures. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the Wendigo. But none of the accounts quite matched what I'd seen. I reported the incident to the local Forest Service, carefully omitting the more fantastic elements of my encounter. They found the marked trees and the footprint, but there was no sign of the creature. The official report blamed it on bear activity and vandals. But I knew the truth. I've been back to those woods since that day, drawn by a mix of fear and fascination. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes, when the wind is right, I catch a whiff of a musky odor that doesn't belong. And on quiet mornings, I swear I can hear distant roars echoing through the valleys. The experience changed me. I still run, but never alone, never without my phone, and never in those particular woods. I find myself watching the tree line, listening for sounds that don't belong. And I wonder how many other joggers, hikers, and campers have encountered something out there that they can't explain. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of those intelligent eyes and sharp claws as vivid as the day it happened. I find myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. If this creature exists, what else might be out there? So the next time you're out for a run in the woods or hiking a lonely trail, remember this: we are not alone out there. There are things in this world, ancient things, powerful things that defy our understanding, and sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just come face to face with them. Just pray that if you do, you're faster, smarter, or luckier than I was, because once you've seen what lurks in the shadows of the forest, you can never unsee it, and you'll never look at those quiet woodland trails the same way again. The wilderness is vast, and we understand so little of what lives within it. So run carefully, listen closely, and always be prepared, because out there, in the wild places of the world, you never know when a morning jog might turn into a run for your life. Story 17. The camera doesn't lie. At least, that's what I always believed. But when I reviewed the footage from that night in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My name is Lisa Chen, and I'm a graduate student in wildlife biology at the University of Washington. My thesis project seemed simple enough: use motion-activated cameras to study the nocturnal behavior of black bears in the Olympic National Forest. Little did I know that those cameras would capture something that would turn my world upside down. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out to check my cameras and collect the memory cards. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I loved these solo trips into the wilderness, away from the noise and chaos of Seattle. As I approached my first camera setup, I noticed something odd. The sturdy metal box I'd used to protect the camera from curious animals was dented, as if something large had tried to pry it open. My heart raced as I carefully removed the memory card. What could have done this? I quickly checked the other cameras in the area. 2 more showed signs of tampering, deep scratches marring their protective casings. Whatever had done this was strong and apparently very interested in my equipment. Back at my campsite, I fired up my laptop, eager to see what the cameras had captured. The first few videos were standard fare: deer cautiously approaching, a family of raccoons, even a black bear nosing around curiously. But then I saw it. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. At first, the frame was empty, just moonlit forest floor. Then a shadow moved at the edge of the frame. My breath caught in my throat as a figure stepped into view. It was tall, impossibly tall, standing at least 7 feet high, and it was covered in thick, dark fur. The creature moved with an eerie grace, bipedal but with a gait unlike anything I'd ever seen. It paused, seeming to sniff the air, and then turned towards the camera. I gasped. The face was not quite human, not quite ape, but something in between. Deep-set eyes glinted in the infrared light, intelligence clear in their gaze. The creature reached out towards the camera, and that's when the video cut off. My hands shook as I played the video again and again. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hoax, someone in a costume playing a prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The movement was too fluid, too natural. This was a living, breathing creature. I spent the rest of the day reviewing the footage from the other cameras. 2 more had captured brief glimpses of the creature, always at night, always moving with that strange, fluid grace. In one video, it appeared to be carrying something, a large branch or maybe a small tree, with ease. As night fell, I found myself jumping at every sound outside my tent. The forest, which had always been a place of comfort for me, now felt alien and threatening. What if the creature was out there, watching me even now? Sleep eluded me. My mind raced with questions. Was this the legendary Sasquatch? If so, how had it managed to stay hidden for so long? And what should I do with this footage? As a scientist, I knew the proper course of action would be to report my findings, to share this potentially groundbreaking discovery with my professors and colleagues. But another part of me hesitated. I thought about how the scientific community often treated those who claimed to have evidence of cryptids, the ridicule, the damaged reputations. Was I ready for that? Moreover, I thought about the creature itself. If it was real, if there truly was an undiscovered primate species living in these forests, what would exposure mean for it? I imagined researchers and thrill-seekers flooding the area, disrupting its habitat, maybe even trying to capture it. A twig snapped outside my tent, jolting me from my thoughts. I held my breath, straining my ears. There it was again, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. My heart pounding, I slowly unzipped the tent flap and peered out. The forest was bathed in moonlight, shadows dancing between the trees, and then I saw it, a dark figure, massive and silent, moving between 2 distant pines. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to capture video of what I was seeing, but by the time I'd unlocked it and opened the camera app, the figure was gone, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined it. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my sleeping bag, jumping at every sound, my mind conjuring images of giant, fur-covered creatures lurking just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I made a decision. I needed to get out of there, to put some distance between myself and whatever was out in those woods. I packed up camp in record time, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. The hike back to my car was tense, every snapping twig and rustling leaf setting my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me, always just out of sight. It wasn't until I was in my car, driving back towards Seattle, that I allowed myself to relax. But as the adrenaline wore off, a new anxiety set in. What was I going to do with what I'd discovered? The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I pored over the footage, analyzing every frame, every pixel. I researched Bigfoot sightings and theories, falling down a rabbit hole of cryptozoology and conspiracy theories. Part of me wanted to share my discovery with the world, to prove once and for all that there were still mysteries out there waiting to be uncovered. But another part, a quieter, more contemplative part, wondered if some secrets were better left uncovered. I thought about the creature I'd seen, how it moved with such purpose through the forest. It had clearly managed to stay hidden for centuries, eluding definitive proof of its existence. Was it right for me to expose it to the world, to subject it to the scrutiny and potential danger that would come with discovery? In the end, I decided to keep the footage to myself, at least for now. I told my advisors that my cameras had malfunctioned, that I'd need to repeat the study. They were disappointed, but understanding. I've been back to those woods many times since that night. I've never captured another clear image of the creature, never had another close encounter. But sometimes, when the light is just right and the forest is quiet, I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow that's too tall to be a bear, too graceful to be a human. And I'll smile, knowing that out there, beyond the reach of our modern world, there are still wonders waiting to be discovered. My encounter changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that our world is far more mysterious and magical than we give it credit for. Now, every time I step into the forest, I'm not just looking for bears or deer. I'm looking for that hint of the unknown, that glimpse of something beyond our understanding. Because now I know the truth. There are creatures out there that defy explanation, beings that blur the line between legend and reality. I may never capture another video like the one from that fateful night. I may never have definitive proof to share with the world, but that's okay, because sometimes the magic lies in the mystery. And in a world where Sasquatch can exist, anything is possible. As I prepare for my next research trip, packing my cameras and gear, I can't help but feel a thrill of excitement. What will I see this time? What new mysteries await in the deep, dark woods? One thing's for certain, I'll be watching. And somewhere out there in the shadows of the ancient forest, I know something will be watching back. Story 18. The storm raged like a beast unleashed from the depths of hell itself. But it wasn't the howling wind or the crashing waves that chilled me to the bone that night. It was what I saw in those churning waters, a sight that would haunt me for years to come and change everything I thought I knew about the world. My name is Mark Sullivan, and I've been the keeper of the Crowley Point Lighthouse for the past 15 years. It's a solitary life, but one I've always found peaceful, or at least I did, until that fateful night when the line between reality and nightmare blurred beyond recognition. It was early October, and a massive nor'easter was battering the New England coast. I'd battened down everything I could and was settled in for a long night of vigilance, making sure the light kept burning to guide any ships foolish enough to be out in such weather. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows of the lighthouse keeper's cottage. Rain lashed against the glass in sheets, distorting my view of the angry sea below. But even through the storm's fury, I kept a watchful eye on the waters, as was my duty. It was nearing midnight when I first saw it. A flash of movement in the waves, too large to be any normal sea creature. I blinked, sure my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again. A massive humanoid shape, breaching the surface like some nightmarish parody of a whale. I scrambled for the binoculars I kept by the window, my hands shaking as I raised them to my eyes. For a long moment, I saw nothing but churning waves and driving rain. Then, illuminated by a flash of lightning, I saw it clearly. A head broke the surface, followed by broad shoulders. But this was no swimmer or shipwreck victim. The head was elongated, almost ape-like, covered in what looked like thick, dark fur. As it turned, I caught a glimpse of its face, a face that was neither fully human nor fully animal, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. I dropped the binoculars, stumbling back from the window. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of the light and storm. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was all too real. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the rest of the night pacing the lighthouse, my eyes constantly drawn to the raging sea below. But the creature, whatever it was, didn't show itself again. As dawn broke and the storm began to subside, I ventured outside to assess any damage. The rain had stopped, but a thick fog had rolled in, shrouding the lighthouse in an eerie mist. That's when I saw them, the footprints. They led from the water's edge up towards the lighthouse, each print easily twice the size of my own foot. They were clearly bipedal, but the shape was all wrong for any human foot I'd ever seen. The toes were too long, ending in what looked like claw marks gouged into the wet sand. My heart pounding, I followed the tracks. They circled the lighthouse once before heading back towards the sea, disappearing into the surf. Whatever had made these prints was large, heavy, and definitely not human. In the light of day, it was tempting to dismiss what I'd seen as a product of an overactive imagination, fueled by too many lonely nights and old sea legends. But those footprints, they were undeniably real. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessively watching the sea, hoping for another glimpse of the creature. I scoured the internet for any similar sightings, falling down a rabbit hole of cryptozoology and sea monster legends. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I'd seen was something unknown to science, a creature that blurred the line between legend and reality. A week after the storm, I was doing my nightly checks of the lighthouse when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, rumbling noise, somewhere between a growl and a moan, coming from just outside the lighthouse door. With shaking hands, I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. At first, I saw nothing but fog. Then, slowly, a shape began to emerge from the mist. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. As it turned towards the lighthouse, I caught a glimpse of its face, the same face I'd seen in the storm, with those eerily intelligent eyes. For a long moment, we stared at each other. Me, frozen in fear behind the glass, and this impossible creature, studying me with an intensity that felt almost curious. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and lumbered back towards the sea, disappearing into the fog. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the lighthouse, every creak and groan of the old building setting my nerves on edge. When morning came, I half expected to find it had all been a vivid dream. But there, in the soft sand around the lighthouse, were fresh tracks, the same massive, inhuman footprints I'd seen after the storm. In the weeks that followed, I found myself torn between fear and fascination. Part of me wanted to report what I'd seen, to alert authorities or scientists, but another part, a part that grew stronger with each passing day, felt protective of the creature and its secret existence. I began to leave out fish and other seafood, placing them at the edge of the water at night. More often than not, they'd be gone by morning, with those now familiar tracks in the sand the only sign of my nocturnal visitor. As the weeks turned to months, the sightings became more frequent, never for long and never too close, but enough for me to start recognizing patterns. The creature seemed most active during storms or on foggy nights. It moved with a grace that belied its size, equally at home in the water as on land. I started keeping a journal, meticulously recording each encounter, each track, each strange sound in the night. I knew that what I was experiencing was extraordinary, possibly world-changing if it ever came to light. But the more I learned about my mysterious visitor, the more certain I became that it needed to remain a secret. One night, almost a year after that first sighting, I had my closest encounter yet. I was outside, placing the nightly offering of fish by the water's edge, when I heard the now familiar sound of heavy footsteps behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, to find the creature standing mere feet away. Up close, it was even more awe-inspiring. Muscles rippled beneath its thick fur, and I could see the intelligence shining in its deep-set eyes. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other. Then, slowly, deliberately, it reached out and took the fish from my hand, its movement surprisingly gentle for a being of its size. As it turned to go, it paused, looking back at me, and in that moment I felt a connection, an understanding that transcended words. This creature, this impossible being that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world, was not so different from me. We were both solitary creatures, guardians of our own lonely domains. From that night on, our encounters became almost routine. It would visit most nights, sometimes just watching from a distance, other times coming close enough for me to see the individual hairs in its fur. I found myself talking to it, sharing the mundane details of my day. Whether it understood me or not, I'll never know, but it seemed to listen intently. Years have passed since that stormy night when I first spotted the creature in the waves. I'm older now, my hair greyed by time and solitude. But I'm no longer truly alone. My nightly visitor, my impossible friend, has become as much a part of my life as the lighthouse itself. I know that someday I'll have to leave this place. Age or illness will force me to retire, to rejoin the world of men and cities, and when that day comes, I'll have a choice to make. Do I take my secrets with me to the grave, preserving the mystery and wonder of what I've experienced? Or do I share my story, my journals, my evidence, and risk exposing this magnificent creature to a world that might not understand or appreciate it? For now, that decision remains in the future. Tonight, as I have for so many nights before, I'll climb the lighthouse steps, light the beacon and wait. Wait for the familiar sound of heavy footsteps, for the sight of a figure emerging from the mist. And I'll smile, knowing that in this lonely corner of the world, magic still exists, that there are still wonders out there, creatures that defy explanation, waiting to be discovered by those with open eyes and open hearts. As I look out over the darkening sea, I can't help but feel grateful for the storm that brought this creature into my life, for the mystery and wonder it has brought to my solitary existence. Because now I know the truth. The world is far more mysterious, far more magical than we could ever imagine. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get a glimpse of that magic, out there in the swirling mists between land and sea. Story 19. The bone-chilling scream that echoed through the forest wasn't human. It wasn't animal either. It was something else, something that made my blood run cold and my heart race with primal fear. That's when I knew we weren't alone in these woods, and our hiking trip had just become a fight for survival. My name is Amy Carver, and what was supposed to be a weekend adventure with friends turned into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. It all started innocently enough. 5 of us, all avid hikers, decided to explore a remote trail in the Adirondacks, known for its breathtaking views and challenging terrain. What we didn't know was that it was also known for something far more sinister. Our group consisted of myself, my boyfriend Jake, our friends Sarah and Mike's younger brother Tom. We were all experienced outdoors people, confident in our abilities to handle whatever the wilderness might throw at us, or so we thought. The first day of our hike was everything we'd hoped for. The autumn colors were in full splendor, painting the landscape in vibrant reds, oranges, and golds. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. We made good progress, laughing and joking as we navigated the rugged trail. It wasn't until we made camp that evening that things started to feel off. As we sat around the campfire, Tom mentioned that he'd heard strange stories about these woods, legends of a creature called the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that possessed humans and turned them into insatiable, cannibalistic monsters. "Come on, Tom," Mike had laughed, tossing a marshmallow at his brother. "Don't tell me you believe in that crap." But Tom's words had planted a seed of unease in my mind. As I lay in my tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming during the day, now felt oppressive and threatening. I must have eventually drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by Sarah's scream. I scrambled out of my tent to find the others already up, looking around wildly. "What happened?" Jake asked, his voice tense. Sarah was pale, her eyes wide with fear. I saw something," she stammered, "just at the edge of the campsite. It was big, and wrong somehow. We searched the perimeter of our camp but found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to indicate that anything had been there. But as we returned to the center of our campsite, we all stopped short. There, arranged in a perfect circle around our tents, were bones, animal bones, picked clean and bleached white by the sun. They hadn't been there when we'd gone to sleep. "Okay, this isn't funny," Mike said, his voice shaking slightly. "Tom, if this is your idea of a joke—" But one look at Tom's terrified face told us this was no prank. We debated what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and get out of there as fast as possible, but we were at least a day's hike from the nearest road, and the thought of trying to navigate these unfamiliar trails in the dark was daunting. In the end, we decided to wait until first light to make our way back. None of us slept much that night. We took turns keeping watch, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. As dawn broke, we quickly packed up camp, eager to put this place behind us. But as we shouldered our packs and prepared to leave, Tom let out a gasp. "Guys," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "look at the trees." We all turned, and I felt my heart drop. The trees surrounding our campsite were marked with deep gouges, too high up to have been made by any normal animal. They formed strange, intricate patterns that seemed to dance before my eyes, making me dizzy if I looked at them too long. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, voicing what we were all thinking. "Now!" We set off at a brisk pace, no one speaking much as we focused on putting as much distance between us and that campsite as possible. But as the day wore on, a sense of unease grew. The trail didn't look familiar. Landmarks we remembered from our hike-in were missing or changed. "We must have taken a wrong turn," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. We consulted our map and compass, trying to get our bearings, but nothing made sense. It was as if the forest itself had changed overnight, rearranging itself to confuse and disorient us. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, panic started to set in. We were lost in a forest that seemed increasingly hostile, with night approaching fast. That's when we heard it, the scream. It started low, almost like the wind, but quickly rose to a pitch that set my teeth on edge. It was a sound of hunger, of rage, of inhuman need. We ran. There was no discussion, no plan. We just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces and arms. I could hear it behind us, whatever it was, moving through the forest with a speed and grace that defied its size. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish chase, but eventually, gasping for breath, we burst into a small clearing, and there we saw it. At first glance, it looked almost human. But as it turned towards us, I realized how wrong that first impression was. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long and joints that bent in ways they shouldn't. Its skin was a sickly pale grey, stretched tight over a skeletal frame, but it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come, sunken, glowing eyes over a mouth filled with needle-sharp teeth, opened in a silent scream. For a moment, we all stood frozen, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. Then Mike let out a strangled yell, and the spell was broken. We scattered, each of us running in different directions. I could hear the others crashing through the underbrush, their panicked breathing and occasional cries of terror. But I didn't dare look back. I just ran, my lungs burning, my legs aching, driven by a primal fear I'd never experienced before. I don't know how long I ran, or how far. Eventually, I found myself at the base of a steep hill. With no other options, I started to climb. My hands were bleeding from grabbing at rocks and roots, but I didn't feel the pain. All I could think about was getting away, getting to safety. As I neared the top of the hill, I heard something that made my heart soar, the sound of a helicopter. I redoubled my efforts, finally cresting the hill to find myself on a rocky outcropping, and there, in the distance, I could see the helicopter, its searchlights sweeping the forest below. I waved my arms frantically, screaming at the top of my lungs. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought they hadn't seen me, but then the helicopter banked, turning towards me. The rest is a blur. I remember being winched up into the helicopter, the faces of the rescue team looking at me with concern. I remember trying to explain about the others, about the creature in the woods. But the words wouldn't come. All I could do was cry as the realization hit me. I was safe, but my friends were still out there. The search went on for days. They found Sarah and Tom, both traumatized but physically unharmed. Of Jake and Mike, there was no sign. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead from exposure or a fall. But I know the truth. I know what's out there in those woods, waiting, hunting. It's been 5 years since that nightmarish trip. I've tried to move on, to forget. But every time I close my eyes, I see that creature. I hear that inhuman scream echoing through the trees. I've never gone back to those woods. I can't. But sometimes, on cold autumn nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself wondering, are Jake and Mike still out there? Did they escape, or did they become something else? And I wonder about that creature, that Wendigo. Is it still there, lurking in the dark heart of the forest, waiting for more unsuspecting hikers to wander into its domain? I don't have answers to these questions. All I know is that the world is darker and more dangerous than I ever imagined. There are things out there, creatures that defy explanation, that lurk just beyond the edge of firelight. So if you're planning a hike in the remote wilderness, remember my story. Stay on the marked trails. Don't go out alone. And if you hear a scream in the night that doesn't sound quite human, run, and don't look back. Because in the deep, dark woods, not all legends are just stories. Some of them have teeth. Story 20. The surface of the lake erupted in a frenzy of thrashing water and ear-splitting roars. And in that moment, I knew our fishing trip had just become a fight for survival against something that shouldn't exist. My name is Tom Hawkins, and I've been guiding fishing trips on Lake Shadowmere for over 2 decades. I thought I knew every inch of these waters, every fish that swam beneath the surface. But that night, I learned that some secrets run deeper than any lake, and some creatures defy everything we think we know about the natural world. It was supposed to be a routine overnight fishing expedition. My group consisted of 4 clients, John and his son Billy, both experienced anglers, and a married couple, Sarah and Mike, who were new to the sport but eager to learn. We'd spent the day on the water, reeling in a decent catch of trout and bass, and as the sun began to set, we anchored our 2 boats in a sheltered cove for the night. The evening was peaceful, the kind of perfect summer night that makes you glad to be alive. The air was warm, filled with the scent of pine and the gentle lapping of water against the boats. We'd finished our dinner of freshly caught fish and were settling in for the night, swapping stories and enjoying the star-filled sky. It was close to midnight when we heard it, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the depths of the lake itself. At first, I thought it might be distant thunder, but the sky was clear, lit only by a nearly full moon. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with nervousness. I forced a reassuring smile. "Probably just some big fish jumping. Nothing to worry about." But even as I said it, I felt a sense of unease creeping over me. In all my years on this lake, I'd never heard anything quite like that sound. We fell into an uneasy silence, all of us straining our ears for any repeat of the noise. For a long moment, all we could hear was the gentle lapping of water against the boats and the distant hoot of an owl. Then it came again, louder this time, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to vibrate through the water itself, and this time it was accompanied by movement, a large wake heading straight for our boats. "Everyone, stay calm," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "It's probably just a big catfish or—" My words were cut off as something massive struck the bottom of my boat, nearly capsizing us. We all grabbed for the sides, struggling to keep our balance as the boat rocked violently. "What the hell was that?" John yelled, clutching his son close. Before I could answer, it happened again. This time, I caught a glimpse of something breaking the surface, a dark shape, far larger than any fish I'd ever seen in these waters. "Get the spotlight!" I shouted to Mike, who was closest to our gear. He fumbled with the powerful light, finally managing to switch it on and sweep its beam across the water. For a second, all we saw was the rippling surface of the lake. Then, about 50 yards out, something broke the surface. At first, all I could make out was a massive serpentine neck rising from the water. Then I saw the head, and my blood ran cold. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, reptilian, with a long snout filled with gleaming teeth, and eyes that reflected the spotlight with an eerie, intelligent glow. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the creature's low growl. For a long moment, we all stared in stunned silence as the creature regarded us, its head swaying slightly from side to side. Then, with a roar that shook the very air around us, it dove back beneath the surface. "Start the engines!" I yelled, snapping out of my shock. "We need to get to shore, now!" But as John turned the key in his boat, we were met with only a sputtering sound. The engine wouldn't start. "It's dead!" John shouted, panic clear in his voice. "The battery must be drained." I tried my own engine, only to be met with the same result. Whatever that creature was, it seemed to have affected our electronics. "Okay, everyone stay calm," I said, trying to think clearly despite the fear clouding my mind. "We've got paddles. We'll have to make for shore that way." We began to paddle furiously, our eyes constantly scanning the dark water around us. The shore wasn't far, maybe a quarter mile, but in that moment it might as well have been miles. We'd made it about halfway when we heard it again, that bone-chilling roar, closer this time. I turned to see a massive wake heading straight for us, moving far faster than we could paddle. "Brace yourselves!" I shouted. The impact came a second later, sending us all sprawling. Water sloshed over the sides of the boats, and I heard Sarah scream as she nearly went overboard. Mike managed to grab her at the last second, pulling her back in. As we struggled to right ourselves, I saw it again, that long serpentine neck rising from the water, now close enough that I could see every scale, every ridge on its prehistoric-looking head. Its eyes locked onto us, and I saw something in them that chilled me to my core, intelligence and hunger. "Paddle!" I yelled, my voice hoarse with fear. "Paddle for your lives!" We redoubled our efforts, our arms burning with exertion as we pushed towards the shore. The creature dove again, and I could feel it moving beneath us, circling our boats like a massive shark. Just as I thought we might make it, it struck again. This time, its massive head rose between our two boats, its jaws opening to reveal rows of dagger-like teeth. John's boat was lifted clear out of the water, tipping sideways and sending him and Billy tumbling into the lake. "John! Billy!" Sarah screamed. I dove into the water without thinking, swimming towards where I'd seen them fall. The water was dark and cold, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't see them. Then I felt something brush against my leg, not the smooth scales of the creature, but the fabric of a jacket. I grabbed hold, pulling with all my might. It was Billy, his eyes wide with terror. I broke the surface, gasping for air, and saw John nearby, already swimming hard for the overturned boat. "Get to the shore!" I yelled, pushing Billy in that direction before diving back under. The next few minutes were a blur of thrashing water, screams, and that terrible roaring. Somehow, we all made it to the rocky shore, collapsing on the ground, soaked and trembling. As we caught our breath, I looked back out at the lake. Our boats were gone, presumably sunk, and there, illuminated by the moonlight, I saw it one last time, that impossible creature, its long neck rising from the water as it watched us. Then ran with a final roar that echoed across the lake. It sank beneath the surface, disappearing as if it had never been. We spent a long, cold night huddled on that shore, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, we hiked out, eventually finding a ranger station where we could call for help. Of course, no one believed our story. The official report chalked it up to a freak storm and equipment failure. Our boats were never found, and extensive searches of the lake turned up nothing unusual. But I know what I saw that night. I know that somewhere in the depths of Lake Shadowmere, there's a creature that defies explanation, a living fossil from an age long past. I don't guide fishing trips anymore. I can't bring myself to go back out on that lake, knowing what lurks beneath the surface. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I find myself drawn to the shore. And as I stand there, watching the still waters, I wonder, is it still out there, waiting? And how long before someone else discovers the terrifying secret of Lake Shadowmere? Because now, I know the truth. Our world is far more mysterious, far more dangerous than we could ever imagine. And sometimes, the greatest dangers are the ones that lurk just beneath the surface, waiting for the unwary to venture too far from shore.